There is a country the size of South Carolina that contains more ancient standing stones than all of France, all of Germany, all of Spain, and all of Scandinavia combined. Not a little more, a lot more. Thousands upon thousands of them, planted into the soil of a cold, rain-soaked land at the far northwestern edge of the known world, placed there by people who left no writing, no name, and almost no explanation. They are still standing now. Some of them have been standing for 6,000 years. They were old when the pyramids were new. They were ancient when Rome was still a collection of mud huts beside a river nobody important had heard of yet. And for 6,000 years, almost nobody has been able to explain with any certainty why there are so many of them, why they are where they are, who put them there, or what the people who built them were trying to say to the universe. Scotland has roughly 500 recorded stone circles alone. That number does not include single standing stones, which add thousands more to the count. It does not include the stone rows, the chambered cairns, the stone-lined avenues, or the features that archaeologists are still discovering using aerial survey and ground-penetrating radar in fields that have been farmed for centuries. The number is probably an undercount. Scotland's stones are everywhere. They are on the tops of mountains. They are at the edges of lochs. They are in the middle of farm fields, incorporated into dry stone walls by farmers who simply built around them rather than move them. They are on windswept Atlantic coasts, where the spray reaches them on storm days. They are in narrow glens, where the light barely reaches the valley floor in winter. And the question of why there are so many of them, specifically in this country, specifically on this land, is one that the best archaeologists in the world have been circling for 2 centuries without landing on a complete answer. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. There are things we know, there are things we can infer, and then there is the part of this story that sits in the gap between what the stones say and what we can hear, which is where it gets interesting. Because the stones are not silent, they are aligned, they are positioned. They relate to one another across distances of miles in ways that are too precise to be accidental and too consistent to be coincidental. They face things, they mark things, and the question of what exactly they were marking and why it mattered so much that tens of thousands of people over hundreds of generations kept building more of them is a question that goes all the way down to the nature of human consciousness itself. What were people trying to hold on to that required so much stone? Start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the stones, but the beginning of Scotland itself. The country that exists now, the one with mountains and lochs and the grey light that photographers spend their whole careers trying to capture, is geologically one of the oldest surfaces on Earth. The Lewisian gneiss of the far northwest, exposed in the islands of the Outer Hebrides, is approximately 3 billion years old. It is some of the most ancient rock on the surface of this planet. When the first cells were forming in the shallow seas of a world that barely had oxygen in its atmosphere, this rock was already there, already consolidated, already part of a planetary crust that had been through collisions and heat that we can barely model. The stones that people built their monuments from are in some cases billions of years younger than the ground they stand on, which means that when you stand beside a standing stone in the Hebrides and feel the grain of it under your fingers, you are touching something that humans shaped roughly 6,000 years ago, standing on something that has been there for 30 million human generations longer than that. This matters, because the people who built the stones knew what they were standing on. They could feel it. They called this land something, in a language that is completely gone now, and whatever they called it, they chose to anchor their cosmology to it in permanent stone in a way that no subsequent population has been able to undo in 6,000 years. The ice retreated from Scotland approximately 12,000 years ago, not all at once, not in a single dramatic withdrawal, but in stages and surges over several thousand years, leaving behind the landscape that exists now. The ice carved the glens. The ice deepened the lochs. The ice stripped the soil from the mountaintops and left the bare grey rock of the Highland summits that catches the light in a particular way on clear days that seems almost designed as if the mountain were a stage set rather than geology. And as the ice retreated, people followed it. Not immediately, not recklessly, but within a few thousand years of the main glacial retreat, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers had reached the far north of Scotland and were living on the edges of what is now the North Sea, which at that point was not a sea but a vast, fertile, low-lying plain connecting Britain to continental Europe. That plain is called Doggerland. It flooded. As the last of the ice melted and sea levels rose, the low ground between what is now Britain and what is now the Netherlands disappeared beneath the waves over the course of several thousand years, a geological event that took place slowly enough that individual people did not experience it as catastrophe, but fast enough that, within a century or two, landscapes that people had lived in and named and built on simply ceased to exist. They are still there, under 60 to 100 meters of the North Sea. There are fishing trawlers that have dragged up worked flint tools and the bones of ancient animals from the seabed. There are sonar surveys that have revealed submerged river valleys and ancient shorelines. Doggerland was real, it was inhabited, and it went under. The people who survived that process, who either had the elevation or the boats, or both to reach what became the British Isles, became the ancestors of the first permanent settlers of what would become Scotland. They are the people who eventually built the first monuments. And they were building them against a background of having already lost one world to water. Whatever the stones were for, they were built by people who knew on a deep, ancestral level that the land could vanish. The first monuments in Scotland predate the standing stones. The chambered cairns, the stone-covered burial mounds with their long internal chambers aligned to specific points on the horizon, begin to appear around 5,500 years ago. In the Neolithic period, when the people of Scotland were beginning to shift toward a more settled agricultural existence, they were still largely dependent on cattle and on wild resources, but the idea of permanence had taken hold. The idea that you could mark a place, that you could declare it meaningful by investing enormous effort in transforming it, that you could leave something for the people who came after you. The Neolithic farmers of Scotland built their burial chambers first. The dead were important. The dead were kept. The bones of the dead were sometimes removed and moved, curated and rearranged over generations, as if the dead themselves were not fixed, but rather were ongoing participants in the life of the community. The chambers that held them were constructed with a sophistication that is still startling when you examine it closely. Huge upright stones were selected, transported, and set in the ground with precision that required detailed planning. Capstones weighing tons were lifted and placed, and then the whole thing was covered with earth and stone to create a mound that could be seen from a distance, a permanent feature of the landscape that said here, something happened here, remember this place. But the standing stones came later, and they came everywhere, and they multiplied in a way that suggests something different was driving their construction. The chambered cairns are about the dead, about memory, about a specific community's relationship to its ancestors. The standing stones are about something else. They are about the sky. They are about cycles. They are about the relationship between the earth and time itself. And Scotland got more of them than anywhere else, which means that whatever force drove their construction found its fullest expression here. On this particular piece of land, in this particular light, under these particular skies. The Orkney Islands sit at the top of Scotland, separated from the mainland by a stretch of water called the Pentland Firth, which is one of the most dangerous stretches of open sea in the British Isles. The tidal races there can exceed 12 knots. The weather is severe. The winters are dark, in a way that people who have not experienced far northern latitudes struggle to imagine. At the winter solstice in Orkney, the sun rises at about 9 in the morning and sets by 3 in the afternoon. 6 hours of daylight. And for several weeks around the solstice, the sun barely clears the horizon before sinking back down, moving through the sky in a low, flat arc that never gets far above the southern horizon. If you have grown up in a temperate or tropical climate, you cannot fully feel what that does to the human psyche. But people in Orkney 5,000 years ago were experiencing it every winter of their lives, and they were tracking it. They were watching the sun move along the horizon. They were noting exactly where it rose and set each day, and they were building structures that would tell them, year after year, when the worst was over, when the light was coming back. The Neolithic complex at Orkney is now recognized as one of the most significant archaeological landscapes in the world. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And at its heart is a set of structures so precisely designed, so carefully oriented to the movements of the sun and moon, that they represent a form of astronomical knowledge that rivals anything written down for the next 3,000 years. The Ring of Brodgar is a stone circle approximately 104 meters in diameter, the third largest in Britain, set on a narrow isthmus between two lochs. It originally contained 60 stones, of which 27 survive. It was built somewhere between 3,200 and 2,500 years before the Common Era, which makes it roughly as old as the Great Pyramid of Giza, and possibly older. The stones of Stenness, a few kilometers away, are older still, dating to around 3,100 years before the Common Era, making them among the very oldest stone circles on Earth. There are 12 stones standing, though the original circle may have had 12 or as few as 4, rising to heights of almost 6 meters, pale and jagged against the flat Orcadian sky. Between them, connected by sightlines and landscape features, sits Maeshowe, a chambered cairn, yes, but one so precisely aligned that at the winter solstice, the setting sun enters its long entrance passage and illuminates the back wall of the central chamber, throwing a beam of gold light across the darkness for a few minutes at the moment of the year's turning. Somebody designed that. Somebody laid out that passage with such exactness that it has worked every winter for 5,000 years. That is not accidental. That is engineering. That is an expression of knowledge about the sun's movements that required sustained, careful, multi-generational observation. And it was done without writing. It was done in stone. The question that archaeology has been circling for a century and a half is the obvious one. How did Neolithic people accumulate that level of astronomical knowledge? How did they measure angles with sufficient precision to orient a passage to the winter solstice? How did they understand the lunar cycle well enough to incorporate its 19-year standstill into their monument layouts? The answer, as far as archaeologists can determine, is time. They had extraordinary amounts of time. In a society without writing, knowledge is maintained by observation and repetition and transmission across generations. You watch the sun move along the horizon for a year, and then you do it again, and then you do it again, and you compare what you see each time. You notice that the sun reaches the same point on the horizon at the same time each year. You notice that it is possible to predict, to an accuracy of a day or two, where the sun will rise tomorrow if you know where it rose today. You notice the moon's more complex dance, its monthly cycle and its longer wobble across the sky, its rising and setting points shifting slightly each month in a pattern that repeats every 18.6 years. These things are visible. They are there to be seen by anyone who pays attention. The people of Neolithic Orkney paid attention for generations, and they built monuments that encoded what they saw, not because they were naive or primitive or groping in the dark, but because they were doing exactly what humans do when they notice a pattern that matters. They wrote it down, in the only medium they had, in stone. Now, why Scotland? Why did this impulse toward monument building find such extraordinary expression in this particular northern land, and not equally elsewhere? Part of the answer is geography. Scotland's position at the far northwestern edge of the habitable world means that its seasonal extremes are more dramatic than those of Central Europe. The difference between the longest day and the shortest day is greater in Scotland than it is in France or Spain or Greece. The sun's position on the horizon at the summer solstice versus the winter solstice shifts through a larger angle. The contrast between summer abundance and winter scarcity is more stark. The reason to track the solar calendar, to know with precision when the seasons were turning, was more urgent here than in milder climates. You needed to know when to plant. You needed to know when to move the cattle. You needed to know when the winter would end. And because the extremes were greater, the precision of your calendar had to be greater too, which may be why the monuments of Scotland are often more precisely aligned than those in more southerly latitudes. The stakes were higher. But geography alone does not explain everything, because other societies in similarly extreme latitudes, in Scandinavia, in Iceland, in the far north of Canada, did not build stone circles on the Scottish scale. There is something else operating here. Something about the particular culture that emerged in Neolithic Scotland, about the particular world-view that found expression in these landscapes. And here we have to enter the territory where evidence becomes thinner and interpretation becomes more necessary. What we know is that the people who built the standing stones were engaged in long-distance exchange. Objects of specific stone types appear at monument sites far from where those stones naturally occur. There is evidence of feasting at monument sites, of large gatherings, of the kind of communal activity that requires organization and coordination across large areas. The monuments were not isolated constructions. They were part of a networked landscape, a world in which specific hills, specific watercourses, specific astronomical alignments were known and shared across hundreds of kilometers. The culture that produced the Orkney complex also produced monuments down the length of Scotland, into northern England, into Wales. There is a coherence to the tradition, a shared grammar of stone and alignment and orientation that suggests a connected world rather than isolated communities independently arriving at similar solutions. And Scotland, particularly its northern and western reaches, seems to have been at the centre of that world, not its periphery, its heart. The Isle of Lewis, the largest of the Outer Hebrides, is a landscape of extraordinary bleakness and extraordinary beauty. It is largely treeless, the result of a combination of ancient deforestation and a climate that makes tree regeneration difficult without shelter. The peat bogs that cover most of its surface have preserved evidence of ancient occupation for archaeologists to find. And at a place called Callanize, on the western coast of Lewis, looking out over Loch Roag toward the open Atlantic, someone built a monument that remains one of the most structurally complex, ancient stone arrangements anywhere in Europe. Callanize, sometimes anglicized as Callanish, consists of a central circle of 13 standing stones, with a chambered cairn at its center that was apparently added somewhat later than the circle itself. But what makes Callanae unique is what extends outward from the central circle. There are 4 stone avenues radiating outward in roughly cardinal directions, though not precisely so, suggesting that the cardinal directions were not the point. The longest avenue extends to the north for approximately 80 meters, a double row of stones creating a processional way that leads toward the circle. And the orientation of that northern avenue points to a feature on the southern horizon, a low hill called Sennoch and Tursa, which in Gaelic means something approximately translating to the Hill of Grief or the Hill of Mourning. When the moon is at its major southern standstill, which happens once every 18.6 years, it rises in the southeast and then, as it moves through the night sky, it appears to briefly skim the horizon near Sennoch and Tursa before rising again. The local tradition in Lewis, recorded in the 19th century but presumably much older, says that on midsummer morning a being called the Shining One walks along the stone avenue to the circle, heralded by a cuckoo, at dawn. The astronomy and the folk tradition coincide. The Shining One is the moon at its standstill. The monument was built to watch for that event, to frame it, to make it visible as a moment of cosmic significance in a way that people gathered at the monument could experience together. The moon does not do the same thing every year. You cannot be certain, without sustained observation over nearly 2 decades, of exactly when the standstill will occur. The builders of Callanize were tracking something that took the entire working life of an adult human being to fully observe. They were building for a timescale that exceeded individual experience. They were thinking in generations. And they built a monument that would still be telling people about the moon's major standstill 1,800 years after it was constructed. It is still there now. It still works. Go to Lewis at the right time of the lunar cycle, and you can still watch the moon do exactly what the builders of Callanize built the monument to show. These are the kinds of facts that tend to be underreported. Not because they are contested, they are not. They are the product of careful astronomical analysis by researchers who have spent decades measuring the monuments and comparing them to calculated historical sky positions. But because they are uncomfortable in a way that is worth examining, the monuments of Scotland are the product of a sophisticated, multi-generational astronomical tradition. The people who built them understood the movements of the sky with a precision that requires sustained, systematic observation over periods of time that exceed a single human lifetime. They encoded that understanding in permanent stone in ways that have survived 6,000 years. And they did all of this without writing, without formal mathematics as we understand it, without any of the institutional infrastructure that we associate with the accumulation and transmission of complex knowledge. This should be astonishing. And in a sense, it is. But what it actually tells us is that the capacity for this kind of sustained, systematic observation and the transmission of complex knowledge across generations is not a product of civilization. It predates civilization by thousands of years. It is simply what humans do when they pay attention to the world long enough. Scotland paid attention, and it built its attention in stone. The count gets stranger when you leave Orkney and Lewis and start looking at the mainland. The concentration of stone circles in Aberdeenshire, in the northeast of Scotland, is one of the most puzzling archaeological phenomena in Britain. This region, now famous for granite and oil and the city of Aberdeen, contains dozens of stone circles of a type found almost nowhere else in the world. They are called recumbent stone circles, and the name describes their defining feature. Each circle contains one stone that has been deliberately laid on its side, horizontally, between two tall, upright flanker stones. The recumbent stone is always the largest stone in the circle. It is always positioned in the southwestern arc of the circle, and the recumbent always faces a specific direction in the sky, the sector in which the moon is visible when it is at or near its maximum southern declination. In other words, every single recumbent stone circle in Aberdeenshire was positioned to frame the full moon rising and crossing the southern sky. The moon, when viewed from inside one of these circles at certain times in the lunar cycle, would appear to float above the recumbent stone like a jewel on a cushion. This is not interpretation. The geometry has been measured. The statistical analysis has been done. The recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire are lunar observatories, purpose-built to watch the moon at specific points in its cycle. There are approximately 90 of them, all in a relatively small area of northeast Scotland. Nowhere else in the world has anything quite like them. Nobody knows why this particular tradition emerged in this particular place, why lunar observation became so culturally central in Aberdeenshire that it generated 90 monuments expressing the same basic idea with variations of size and stone type but consistent underlying orientation. It is one of the genuine mysteries of British prehistory. The circles are there. The alignment is real. The why remains open. What we can say is that the builders of these circles were part of a society in which the moon was not merely a light in the sky. It was a timekeeper, a seasonal marker, possibly a theological entity, certainly a presence that structured daily and ceremonial life in ways that required careful tracking. The monthly cycle of the full moon provides a natural calendar unit. The more complex cycling of the moon's rising and setting points provides longer period markers. A society that tracked the moon carefully had a sophisticated temporal framework for organizing its activities across months, years, and decades. The recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire represent the architectural expression of that framework. They are, in essence, very large, very permanent, very precisely calibrated instruments for knowing what time it was in the cosmic sense, what day of the month, what year of the cycle, where you were in the longer rhythms that governed everything from the timing of planting to the scheduling of large communal gatherings. The argument about precision is important here, because there is a temptation to minimize what the builders of these monuments achieved. To say that they were simply noticing the obvious, that the sun rises and sets, that the moon goes through phases, that these observations do not require sophisticated knowledge, but this misunderstands the monuments. The stone circles of Aberdeenshire are not aligned to the obvious. They are aligned to the maximum southern declination of the moon, which occurs only once every 9 to 10 years within the 18.6-year lunar cycle. To recognize that maximum, to distinguish it from the merely high or merely low positions that occur throughout the cycle, requires years of careful observation. To then construct a monument so precisely oriented to that maximum that it works as a framing device for viewing, it requires surveying skills, geometric understanding, and practical engineering knowledge. The builders had all of these things. They demonstrated them in stone, and they did it 90 times in one region of Scotland alone. There is a glen in the middle of Scotland, in the county of Perthshire, that contains the longest stone rows in Britain. Machrie Moor, on the Isle of Arran, contains multiple stone circles in close proximity. The Kilmartin Glen in Argyll holds one of the densest concentrations of Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments in Britain, including stone circles, standing stones, cairns, rock carvings, and cup and ring marks, stretching along a valley that appears to have been deliberately chosen as a ceremonial landscape. Walk the full length of Kilmartin Glen from the chambered cairn at Nether, Largy North, to the Henge Monument at Temple Wood, and you cover approximately 5 kilometres of some of the most monument-saturated ground in Europe. The monuments there span roughly 2,000 years of continuous use and construction. Different communities, across many generations, chose to add to the same landscape rather than to start fresh elsewhere. This tells us something important. These places were not chosen arbitrarily. They were understood to be significant. The significance was transmitted, remembered, and respected across spans of time that dwarf the entire period of recorded history. Whatever the monuments meant, the meaning lasted long enough that people who lived 2,000 years after the first builders still knew they were building in a place that mattered. The cup and ring marks are one of the strangest elements of the Scottish monument tradition. They appear carved into natural rock surfaces across Scotland, often in association with standing stones and stone circles, sometimes at considerable distances from any visible monument. They are exactly what the name suggests. Small circular depressions, carved into rock, sometimes surrounded by one or more concentric rings, sometimes connected by carved channels, sometimes arranged in complex patterns that cover large rock surfaces. They appear on the surfaces of boulders. They appear on outcrops of bedrock. They appear on the surfaces of standing stones themselves and on the capstones of chambered cairns. Nobody knows what they mean. Not really. There are theories. They have been interpreted as maps, as astronomical symbols, as fertility symbols, as religious symbols, as territorial markers, as simply decorative. The best current thinking is that they probably had multiple meanings in different contexts, and that the meaning varied by period, by location, by community. What is clear is that they were made with care and over a long period of time. Some of them appear to be at least 5,000 years old, some are probably considerably older, and they appear in Scotland in numbers that again exceed any other comparable region in Europe. There are thousands of cup and ring marked rocks in Scotland. The concentrations in Argyll and in Northumberland, just south of the Scottish border, are the densest anywhere. What this tells us is that there was a tradition of marking rock surfaces in specific ways that was deeply embedded in the culture of ancient Scotland and the adjacent regions. Whatever they meant, they mattered enough to carve into stone. They were a language. We have lost the grammar, but we have not entirely lost the context. And the context, as archaeologists have increasingly recognized over the past 3 decades, is one of the most interesting dimensions of the Scottish monument tradition. The monuments were not random. They were placed in specific landscape contexts that suggest a sophisticated understanding of how space and visibility and movement interact. Standing stones in Scotland are very often placed at points where multiple valleys intersect, or at the heads of passes through mountain ranges, or at the edges of natural harbours. They mark routes. They are waymarkers in a landscape that people traversed on foot or by water, and they are placed at the points in those routes where decisions had to be made. Which valley do you take? Which pass? Where do you cross the river? The standing stone tells you where you are in that network. It is a landmark. It is permanent. It is visible from a distance. And it is, in some cases, aligned to something astronomical that gives you additional temporal information. You know where you are because the stone is there. You know when you are because of where the sun rises relative to it at this particular time of year. The standing stones of Scotland were, in part, a navigational and calendrical infrastructure for people moving through a complex landscape across generations. They were the roads and the clocks of the Neolithic world. This interpretation has been developed most fully by the archaeologist Alistair Burl, who spent decades cataloguing and analysing the stone circles of Britain and Ireland, and who contributed more than anyone else to the systematic study of their astronomical orientations. Burl was cautious about overinterpretation. He was careful to distinguish between alignments that were statistically significant and those that might be coincidental. But his overall conclusion, reached after examining hundreds of monuments over a career of careful work, was that the astronomical orientations of the Scottish stone circles were real, deliberate, and consistent across a wide range of monument types and locations. The builders knew what they were doing. They were not simply building large objects in the landscape because they had the resources to do so. They were building instruments for tracking time, for marking the turnings of the year, for maintaining a relationship between the human community and the cosmic cycles that governed its existence. Scotland has more of these instruments than anywhere else, because, for reasons that are still not entirely understood, the astronomical tradition that produced them was deeper, longer, and more culturally central in Scotland than in the regions to the south and east. There is another dimension to the story that tends to be underplayed in the popular accounts. The stones were not simply observed, they were experienced. The monuments were places where people gathered, where fire was lit, where the dead were remembered, where the community came together at specific times of year to perform whatever rituals they believed were necessary to maintain the good order of the world. The evidence for feasting at monument sites is extensive. Animal bones have been found at many stone circles and chambered cairns, representing the remains of cattle and other animals consumed at communal events. Pottery fragments appear at monument sites in concentrations that suggest deliberate deposition rather than casual use. Human bones, sometimes from multiple individuals, sometimes rearranged or curated, appear in contexts that suggest the dead played an active ceremonial role in the life of the community. The monuments were not passive structures. They were active centers of social and spiritual life. They were the places where the community was constituted, where the boundaries between the living and the dead were negotiated, where the relationship between human beings and the larger forces of the cosmos was enacted and maintained. And Scotland had more of them because Scotland had, or developed, a cultural tradition in which this kind of monument-centered communal life was more fully elaborated than anywhere else in Europe. The Neolithic is not the whole story. The stone circle tradition in Scotland continued into the Bronze Age, roughly 2,200 years before the Common Era and onward, and the Bronze Age monuments added new dimensions to what was already there. Some of the stone rows that survive in Scotland, particularly on the far north mainland, date to the early Bronze Age rather than the Neolithic. They are different in character from the circles. Rather than enclosing a space, they extend across it, leading the eye and the foot along a specific direction. The longest of them in Scotland are at Midcleth in Caithness, where rows of stones extend down a hillside in a fanning pattern that has been interpreted, with some astronomical support, as a calendar device for tracking the moon. The Caithness rows are in the far north, in a landscape of treeless moorland and enormous skies, where the horizon is so flat and so distant that celestial observations have a clarity that is hard to find elsewhere. Somebody chose that location for a reason. The same logic that placed Callanise on Lewis, where the horizon allowed the moon's standstill to be observed in the best possible way, also placed the Caithness rows in a landscape that maximised the utility of astronomical observation. These were not random choices. These were informed selections made by people who understood what they needed and where they could get it. The landscape of Scotland's far north, of Caithness and Sutherland, and the northern tip of the mainland that looks across to Orkney, is one of the least visited and least understood monument landscapes in Britain. It has not received the same attention as Orkney or Lewis because it is harder to reach and because its monuments are less dramatic individually than the Great Circles. But the density of Neolithic and Bronze Age activity in the far north of the Scottish mainland is extraordinary. There are long cairns, horned cairns, stalled cairns, passage graves, stone circles, standing stones, and stone rows spread across a landscape that was substantially more populated in the Neolithic period than it is today. The current population of Caithness is approximately 25,000 people. In the Neolithic period, the population was obviously much smaller, but the density of monuments suggests that this was not a marginal or peripheral place. It was a centre of activity. People invested enormous effort in transforming this landscape. They built monuments that they then continued to use and add to over centuries and millennia. Whatever this land meant to the people who built those monuments, it was not merely a place to survive, it was a place of significance, a place where the important things happened. What happened here? The honest answer is that we do not know, in the fine-grained way that would satisfy a historian accustomed to written sources. We know the monuments are there. We know their orientations. We know something about when they were built and how they were built. We know from the deposits found at some of them something about how they were used. But the specific rituals, the specific beliefs, the specific stories that the community told itself about what the stones meant and why they were building them are gone. They were carried in language, in song, in ceremony, in the minds of living people. And when those people died without passing those traditions to successors who maintained them, the knowledge died too. What we have are the objects that the traditions produced, the stones themselves, the orientations, the landscape, and the question of what those objects mean is one that archaeology has been approaching asymptotically for a century, getting steadily closer to an answer without quite arriving. The Roman encounter with Scotland is relevant here, not because the Romans built the stones, they most certainly did not, but because the Roman period provides the first written accounts of the peoples of Scotland and their relationship to the ancient monument landscape. The Romans called the far north of Britain Caledonia and its inhabitants Caledonians, or Picts. Neither name comes from the people themselves. Both are Roman impositions. What the people of Caledonia called themselves and their land is not recorded in any surviving text. What the Romans did record was their extraordinary resistance to conquest. The Romans held southern Britain for nearly 4 centuries. They built Hadrian's Wall across the north of England and the more northerly Antonine Wall across the central belt of Scotland. They never successfully conquered Caledonia. They tried. Campaigns under Gnaeus Julius Agricola in the late 1st century CE pushed north to Aberdeenshire and possibly further. There was a battle, described by Agricola's son-in-law Tacitus as Mons Graupius, in which the Caledonians were defeated, tens of thousands of them, according to Roman accounts that were certainly exaggerated. But the defeat, if it happened as described, did not result in conquest. The Caledonians simply retreated into their mountains, and the Romans, after attempting several more times across the following centuries to establish permanent control of the north, eventually gave up. Why does this matter for the story of the stones? Because the people of Caledonia who resisted Rome were, in archaeological terms, Iron Age peoples whose culture was continuous through many transformations, with the Neolithic and Bronze Age cultures that built the monuments. They knew the stones were there. They lived among them. They farmed around them. They gave them names. They incorporated them into their landscape understanding. And their language, the Brittonic Celtic language that would later evolve into what we now call Pictish, had names for the monuments that reflected a live relationship to them rather than an archaeological curiosity. The standing stones were not mysterious to the Iron Age inhabitants of Scotland. They were known. They were part of the landscape in the same way that hills and rivers are part of the landscape. They were, in some cases, still in ceremonial use. The tradition of using ancient monument sites as gathering places, as sacred landscapes, did not die with the Neolithic. It persisted, in transformed and adapted form, into the Iron Age and beyond. The Irish mythological tradition, which is in some ways a window into the broader cultural world of Iron Age and early medieval Britain and Ireland, is full of references to ancient mounds and standing stones as places where the boundary between this world and the other world is thin, places where the fairy folk live, where the dead can be reached, where prophecy is possible. This is almost certainly a late transmission of a much older set of ideas that were already ancient when the Iron Age began. The standing stones of Scotland were embedded in a mythological and spiritual landscape that persisted, transformed but recognizable, for thousands of years after the people who built them were gone. The Picts are one of the great mysteries of Scottish history. They appear in historical sources from roughly the late 3rd century CE onward, when Roman writers begin to distinguish them by name from other peoples of the north. They are described as tattooed or painted warriors, as fierce fighters, as the people beyond the walls. They left a remarkable visual tradition. Carved symbol stones appear across northern and eastern Scotland in large numbers, stones incised with abstract symbols, geometric designs, animal figures, and, in the later period, combined with Christian iconography. The symbols are clearly a coherent system. The same symbols appear again and again on stones across a wide geographic area, suggesting a shared symbolic vocabulary, a kind of writing or heraldic system that is not yet fully understood. Many of the Pictish symbol stones are associated with, or were found near, much older Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments. The Picts were placing their own symbol stones in landscapes that were already ancient, already layered with the meanings that earlier communities had built into them. They were adding to a tradition of marking the landscape with permanent stone, a tradition that had been going on in Scotland for 3,000 years before the first Pictish symbol stone was carved. This is one of the things that makes Scotland different. In many parts of Europe, the ancient monument tradition was broken. New peoples arrived, new religions swept away the old sacred sites were destroyed or built over or simply forgotten. In Scotland, the tradition of venerating ancient landscape features, of incorporating them into a living cultural practice, persisted with remarkable continuity. The standing stones were not torn down. When Christianity came to Scotland, largely through the mission of Irish monks in the 6th and 7th centuries CE, the church did not destroy the standing stones. In some cases, crosses were carved onto them, claiming them for the new tradition while acknowledging that the landscape significance they embodied was still real and still felt. The standing stone at Kildalton on Islay stands next to a carved cross. The cross is early medieval, the stone is prehistoric. The decision to put the cross there was not accidental. It was a recognition that this stone marked a place that had power, that the power was real even if its source was now interpreted differently, and that the new tradition could claim that power by placing its own symbol in proximity to the old one rather than by destroying it. This is not unique to Scotland. Similar processes of Christian reinterpretation of prehistoric monument landscapes occurred across Britain and Ireland. But Scotland's ancient monument tradition was dense enough, and the population continuous enough through the various invasions and migrations of the historical period, that the continuity of reverence for the ancient landscape was maintained more completely here than in many other places. The stones were too many, too embedded, too much a part of the landscape to simply be removed. They were incorporated. They were renamed with Christian or Gaelic names that replaced whatever names the Neolithic builders had given them, names now completely lost, but the stones themselves survived. And with them survived, in transformed and partial form, the sense that they were not simply old rocks. They were places. They had meanings. You approached them with a certain awareness. The Gaelic place name tradition in Scotland carries traces of the ancient monument landscape in ways that are still legible. Names that include the element clach, meaning stone, or care, meaning standing stone or pillar, or tursacan, which is the word used at Callanise and means something like mourning stones or ancient stones or stones of sorrow. These names appear hundreds of times across the Scottish landscape, and they often mark places where standing stones still stand, or where stones were standing until relatively recently, or where the local tradition remembers stones that were removed in historical times. Farmers clearing land in the 18th and 19th centuries removed many standing stones that had stood for 4,000 or 5,000 years. The land improvement movement of that era, which reshaped Scottish agriculture with enclosures, drainage, and the removal of field obstacles, was the most destructive force that the ancient monument landscape had faced since the Neolithic. Many stones were removed and used as building material. Many cairns were quarried for their stone. The landscape that exists now is a significantly depleted version of what existed even 300 years ago, which is itself a significantly depleted version of what existed at the peak of the monument building tradition. The 500 recorded stone circles and the thousands of individual standing stones in Scotland are what survived. We do not know how many were there at the beginning. The figure of 5,000 years of stone building deserves to be held for a moment. The Neolithic in Scotland began approximately 6,500 years ago. The Bronze Age stone building tradition continued until approximately 800 years before the Common Era. That is a span of roughly 5,500 years, during which communities in Scotland were selecting, quarrying, transporting, and erecting large stones in positions that were carefully chosen and astronomically aligned, 5,500 years. To put that in perspective, the interval between the building of Stonehenge and the present day is approximately 4,500 years. The people who built the later Bronze Age stone rows in Scotland were separated from the people who built the first Neolithic chambered cairns by a gap that is itself as long as the entire period from Stonehenge to now. The stone building tradition of Scotland was not an event. It was not an episode. It was an era that lasted longer than all of recorded history. And it was not static across that era. The monuments of different periods differ from each other in ways that reflect changing concerns, changing social organizations, changing relationships to the landscape. The early Neolithic chambered cairns are communal monuments associated with multiple burials, oriented to the daily and seasonal movements of the sun, and connected to a world in which the dead played an active role in the life of the community. The Middle Neolithic and early Bronze Age stone circles are more about astronomical precision, about the tracking of longer cycles, about the creation of spaces where specific celestial events could be observed and experienced collectively. The late Bronze Age stone rows suggest something different again, a more processional quality, a sense of directed movement through the landscape toward a specific goal or ending point. These changes reflect real changes in society, in how communities organized themselves, in what they believed was important to mark and track and remember. But through all of those changes, the fundamental commitment to stone as the medium of lasting significance persisted. Whatever else changed, the impulse to mark the important things in stone remained constant across 55 centuries in Scotland. That is extraordinary. It is probably the longest continuous monument building tradition anywhere in the world. The stone at the center of the colonized circle is significantly older than the rest of the monument, older by 1,000 years or more. A natural monolith, taller than any of the other stones, it may have been recognized and venerated before the construction of the circle around it began. This pattern of natural features being incorporated into constructed monuments is seen at other Scottish sites as well. The Avebury complex in England, which Scotland is often compared to, uses a naturally elevated landscape as its foundation. Many Scottish chambered cairns are built against or over prominent natural rock features. The choice to build was in part a response to what the landscape itself offered. The stone was already there. The builders recognized it, and they built around it, making the natural feature the center of the constructed monument, claiming the significance that the feature already had in the landscape and amplifying it through the architectural frame they added. This is a way of thinking about the relationship between the human and the natural that is worth pausing on. The prehistoric builders of Scotland were not imposing their meanings on a neutral landscape. They were reading a landscape that they believed already had meanings, already had significant places, and they were making those meanings visible, permanent, and shared. The stone circle does not create the significance of the place. It reveals and confirms it. The builders were responding to something they perceived in the land itself. This way of thinking about the relationship between monuments and landscape has been one of the more productive developments in the archaeology of the last 3 decades, largely through the work of scholars like Christopher Tilley and his concept of phenomenological archaeology. The idea is not that we can recover the specific beliefs of Neolithic people, which we cannot, but we can recover something about the experience of being in these landscapes, about how they were perceived and moved through and used, by paying attention to what you can see and hear and feel at these locations, what the views are, how the light falls at different times of year and day, how the sounds of the wind and water interact with the stones, how the monuments relate to each other in terms of visibility and movement. When you do this kind of analysis systematically, patterns emerge. The monuments of Scotland are not placed arbitrarily. They are placed at points in the landscape where specific perceptions are possible, where a particular mountain appears on the horizon when you stand in the circle, where the sound of water can be heard, where a specific view opens up only when you are in the exactly right position. The placement was deliberate. The experience was designed. Something about standing in these circles, at these times of year, looking in these directions, was meant to produce a specific kind of awareness in the people who were there. We cannot know exactly what that awareness was, but we can recognize that it was cultivated, that it was the point, and that the extraordinary effort of monument building was the price the community was willing to pay to make it possible. The question of who exactly built the stones returns us to one of the most fascinating and contested areas of Scottish prehistory. The genetic picture of Britain in the Neolithic period is now considerably clearer than it was 20 years ago, thanks to the ancient DNA revolution that has transformed our understanding of prehistoric population movements. What the genetics tell us is that the Neolithic population of Britain, including Scotland, was largely descended from agricultural migrants who arrived from continental Europe approximately 6,000 years ago, probably via a coastal Atlantic route from what is now France and the Iberian Peninsula. These people, the first farmers of Britain, brought with them the practice of building megalithic monuments, which was already established along the Atlantic facade of Europe before they reached Britain. The earliest chambered cairns and standing stones of Scotland are part of a broader Atlantic megalithic tradition that runs from Portugal and Brittany northward through Britain and Ireland. When Neolithic farmers arrived in Scotland, they brought this tradition with them, adapted it to the new landscape and the new astronomical conditions they encountered at higher latitudes, and, over the following millennia, elaborated it into the extraordinary monument complex that survives today. But the genetics also tell us something more complicated. Around 2,500 years before the Common Era, at approximately the same time as the transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, there was a massive influx of new population into Britain from the continental steppes, the people associated archaeologically with the Beaker culture. Within a few centuries, these incoming steppe ancestry people had replaced somewhere between 50 and 90% of the previous British population. This replacement was not uniform across Britain. In some regions it was more complete than in others, and in Scotland, and particularly in the Atlantic coastal regions of Scotland, the replacement appears to have been less complete than in the lowlands and the south. The people who continued to build stone circles in the Bronze Age, who continued the astronomical monument tradition in Scotland after the Neolithic, were a population that was genetically mixed, carrying varying proportions of the ancient Atlantic Neolithic ancestry and the newer steppe ancestry. The tradition persisted through this demographic transition. Whatever knowledge and belief system drove the monument building was transmitted, at least in part, to the incoming population, or was preserved in sufficient strength by the surviving indigenous component to continue influencing the emerging mixed culture. The Bronze Age stone circles of Scotland are not simply continuations of the Neolithic tradition. They are a transformation of it, shaped by new people carrying new ideas from the East, but built in a landscape that had been shaped by the monument tradition for 2,000 years before they arrived. The stones were already there when the Beaker people came. They did not tear them down, they built more of them. Aberdeenshire is where this Bronze Age continuation of the monument tradition reached its most elaborate expression. The 90 recumbent stone circles of the northeast represent the fullest development of a specifically Scottish and specifically lunar monument tradition. There is nothing quite like them anywhere else. And the fact that they emerged in the northeast, in a region where the Atlantic Neolithic tradition was presumably somewhat weaker than on the western coast and the islands, suggests that the astronomical tradition was capable of being learned and adopted by the incoming population rather than simply being transmitted through biological descent. The steppe ancestry people, who became the Bronze Age inhabitants of Aberdeenshire, adopted and elaborated a monument tradition that was already there in the landscape around them. They built it 90 times. They refined it. They made it their own. And they left it in a landscape where it has been standing for 4,000 years, pointing at the moon. The moon. It keeps coming back to the moon. The Aberdeenshire recumbent circles are oriented to the moon. Callanai is aligned to the moon's major standstill. The stones of Stenness are lunar in their orientation. The standing stones that mark the sides of the Maeshowe passage are positioned to frame the moon's transit. Why was the moon so important in Scotland? Why lunar astronomy specifically, when the Mediterranean world was predominantly solar in its astronomical focus? The answer may be partly practical and partly cultural. Practically, in a high-latitude environment where the differences between summer and winter are extreme, the moon provides a more useful short-term calendar than the sun. The sun's position changes significantly from day to day in the summer and winter, but the moon's monthly cycle provides a reliable, regular, short-term rhythm that can be used to schedule activities within the season. A society that tracks the moon carefully has a more granular calendar than one that only marks the solstices and equinoxes. And in an environment where weather conditions can make planting and harvest windows unpredictable, a more granular calendar is genuinely useful. You need to know not just what time of year it is, but what part of the month you are in. The moon tells you that. The standing stones help you track it. The cultural reasons for the lunar focus are harder to specify, but are probably related to the broader symbolic framework in which the moon was understood as governing cycles of life and death, fertility and withdrawal, that were directly relevant to an agricultural and pastoral society. The waxing and waning of the moon, visible every clear night, provided the most immediate and universally experienced example of cyclical change. In a world where the rhythms of the cosmos were understood as directly affecting the rhythms of life on Earth, end quote, the moon was the most immediate teacher of the lesson that everything that diminishes can return, that darkness is not permanent, that the cycles persist even when you cannot see them. The social dimensions of the monument tradition are worth dwelling on because they are sometimes lost in the focus on astronomical alignments and construction techniques. The monuments were not simply instruments for observation, they were places of gathering. Building a stone circle of any significant size was a project that required the collective effort of a community or network of communities over a period of years, possibly decades. The logistics of quarrying, transporting, and erecting large stones demanded coordination, leadership, planning, and sustained commitment that went far beyond what any single family or small group could manage alone. This means that the stone circles were not simply the product of religious belief in the abstract. They were the product of social organization capable of mobilizing large numbers of people around a shared goal. The construction of a monument was itself an act of community building, a process through which the group constituted itself as a group capable of collective achievement. The finished monument was then the physical residue of that process, a permanent reminder that the community had once done this together, that it was the kind of community that could do this, and that the significance of the project had been confirmed by the effort invested in it. You do not build 90 recumbent stone circles in a landscape unless the activity of building them, as well as the result, has profound social meaning. The communal feasting that has been evidenced at many monument sites fits into this picture. The great gatherings that appear to have taken place at Orcadian monuments like the Ring of Brodgar and Ness of Brodgar, the extraordinary Neolithic settlement site recently excavated near the Ring of Brodgar that appears to have been a centre of communal activity on a truly remarkable scale. These gatherings were not merely practical events. They were the moments at which the dispersed communities of Neolithic Scotland came together, reaffirmed their connections to each other and to the landscape, and participated in the rituals that maintained the social and cosmic order. The food consumed at these gatherings came from across the landscape. Isotope analysis of animal bones has shown that cattle consumed in feasting events at Orcadian monument sites came from multiple different regions, some of them far from Orkney. People were travelling to these gatherings from considerable distances. They were bringing animals that had been raised in other places. They were, in a very real sense, building a world. A world in which the movement of people and animals and ideas across a landscape connected by the monument tradition created a shared cultural identity that transcended the local community and extended across the islands and coasts and glens of what would eventually become Scotland. The Ness of Brodgar excavation deserves special attention here because it has transformed the understanding of what Neolithic Orkney actually was. The site, situated on the narrow isthmus between the Ring of Brodgar and the Stones of Stenness, has been excavated since 2003 and has revealed the foundations of a truly extraordinary Neolithic settlement. There are structures of considerable size, some of them clearly not domestic buildings, with stone furnishings, decorated stonework, and spatial arrangements that suggest ceremonial use. The site was in use for roughly 1,000 years, from approximately 3,300 to 2,300 years before the Common Era. At some point during that millennium, it was deliberately and ceremonially demolished, with large quantities of cattle bone deposited across the site, representing, by some estimates, the remains of hundreds of animals. This was not destruction by invaders. It was an intentional ending, a deliberate and ritually significant closure of a site that had been central to the ceremonial life of Neolithic Orkney for 1,000 years. Whoever decided to end it with one of the largest recorded feasting events of the Neolithic world, a final gathering, a final feast, a deliberate goodbye to something that had mattered for a very long time. Whatever social or cosmological crisis, or simply change, prompted the closure of Ness of Brodgar, the closure of the site did not mean the end of monument building in Orkney. The Ring of Brodgar continued to be a significant landscape feature for centuries afterward. The complex was already ancient by the time it was closed, and the broader tradition of standing stone erection continued across Scotland through the Bronze Age. But the Ness of Brodgar closure does suggest that the tradition was not static, that the communities of Neolithic Scotland were capable of making significant decisions about their ceremonial landscape, of choosing to end things that had been important, and of marking that ending in ways that were themselves significant. The monument tradition had a history. Things were built, used, and sometimes deliberately concluded. The landscape was not simply accumulated. It was managed, edited, reshaped across time in response to whatever the community needed. This brings us to the question that haunts the entire story of Scottish standing stones, the question that sits underneath all the astronomical analysis and the landscape interpretation and the social history. What did the people who built them actually believe? Not in the sense of what specific doctrines or theologies they held, because those are beyond recovery, but in the deeper sense of what their relationship to the world was. How did they understand their place in the cosmos? What did they think the universe was doing, and what did they think their role was in relation to it? The monuments give us clues. And the clues point toward a worldview that is quite different from the dominant worldviews of the modern period, though not without echoes in later religious and philosophical traditions. The monuments suggest a worldview in which the cosmos is fundamentally cyclic. Everything that diminishes returns. Everything that ends begins again. The sun goes away but comes back. The moon darkens but brightens. The seasons pass but return. The dead are not simply gone. They are somewhere in the cycle, available to the community through ritual, through the maintenance of the relationship between the living and the dead that the chambered cairns embody. The standing stones are instruments for maintaining awareness of those cycles. They are not simply calendars in the practical sense, though they are that too. They are expressions of a cosmological conviction that the cycles matter, that the turnings of the sun and moon are events of significance that deserve to be marked, that the community's participation in those events, through the gathering and the ritual and the observation, is part of what keeps the cycles going, not in some naive, magical sense, but in the deeper sense that attention is a form of participation. To watch the sun set into the midwinter horizon and know that it has gone as far as it will go and will now begin to come back is to participate in the turning of the year. The monument makes that participation possible. It makes the exact moment visible. It turns astronomical fact into lived experience. This is not entirely different from what religious traditions of all kinds have done throughout human history. The desire to mark the important turnings of time, to gather at specific places and moments, to perform specific actions that acknowledge the significance of what is happening in the larger cycles of existence, is one of the most persistent human impulses. The specific traditions change, the stories change, the doctrines change, but the impulse to stand somewhere together and acknowledge that the cosmos is doing something important at this moment and that we are here to notice it is recognizable across all the traditions that have preserved it. Scotland built that impulse in stone thousands of times across 5,000 years. Whatever the specific beliefs of the builders, whatever they thought was happening when the sun touched the recumbent stone at midsummer or the moon floated above the flanker stones at the lunar standstill, the underlying impulse is recognizable. It is the same impulse that builds cathedrals and temples and mosques. The scale is different, the architecture is different, but the need that drives it is the same. The question of why Scotland specifically is, in the end, probably not answerable with a single cause. It was geography, because the high latitude position amplified the seasonal extremes that made astronomical tracking most urgent. It was culture, because the Neolithic Atlantic tradition that arrived in Scotland found here a landscape and a social organisation that allowed it to develop to an unusual degree of elaboration. It was continuity, because the tradition once established was maintained with remarkable persistence across thousands of years and multiple demographic changes. And it was probably also something harder to quantify, something about the particular quality of the landscape itself, the sky and the light, and the relationship between land and sea that has struck visitors to Scotland as unusual and significant in every era. The light in Scotland is different. The long summer evenings, when the sky stays bright until after midnight in the far north, and the stars do not fully come out, followed by the deep winter darkness in which the stars and moon are the only lights, create a relationship between human beings and the sky that is more intense than in temperate or tropical latitudes. You notice the sky in Scotland. You have to notice it. It governs your life in ways that are felt rather than calculated. The people who built the standing stones were people for whom the sky was not simply background but foreground, not simply context but content. They built monuments that brought the sky down to earth, that made the movements of the sun and moon visible and tangible and communal. And they built thousands of them, because thousands of communities across 5,000 years found that doing so was necessary, was meaningful, was worth the stone. The word Pictish names a people we barely understand. They appear in the historical record as the dominant inhabitants of northern and eastern Scotland from the late Roman period until the 9th century CE, when the Pictish kingdom was absorbed into the kingdom of Alba that would eventually become Scotland. For a people who were politically dominant in their region for at least 5 centuries, the Picts are frustratingly obscure. They left no surviving literature. Their language, known from a small number of inscriptions in Roman and Ogham scripts, is not fully decoded. Their symbol stones, which appear across their territory in substantial numbers, represent a coherent visual system that we cannot yet read. What we know of them comes largely from the accounts of their neighbours and enemies, Irish monks and English historians, who described them from the outside and with varying degrees of accuracy and sympathy. The Picts were the people of Scotland in the historical period, and they had been there, continuously, through all the transformations of the centuries since the Neolithic. Whatever they believed, whatever their relationship to the ancient monuments of their landscape, it was the culmination of a tradition of habitation that extended back 5,000 years before they appear in any written source. The Pictish symbol stones are relevant to the story of the standing stones because many of them were erected at or near prehistoric monument sites. The Picts were not building new stone circles. That tradition had ended approximately 2,000 years before their recorded history begins. But they were continuing to use stone as the medium for marking significant places, significant events, significant identities. They were doing, in their own visual vocabulary, what the Neolithic and Bronze Age communities had done in their vocabulary of circles and alignments. They were writing on the landscape in stone. The specific content of what they wrote is different, because their concerns were different, but the choice of medium, permanent stone in a specific landscape location connects them to the longer tradition. The landscape of eastern Scotland, from Aberdeenshire down through Angus and into Perthshire, is littered with Pictish symbol stones, many of them in proximity to the recumbent stone circles of the Neolithic Bronze Age period. It is not possible to say with certainty that the Picts knew what the older monuments were for, but it seems very unlikely that people who built with the same material in the same landscape were entirely ignorant of what the older stones meant to their predecessors. More probably, the older monuments were understood as marks of the ancestors, as signs that this land had always been significant, and the Pictish stones added a new layer to an already layered landscape, rather than replacing or ignoring what was there. The Norse arrived in Scotland, particularly in the northern and western islands, from roughly the 8th century CE onward. They came as raiders first, and then as settlers, and in Orkney and Shetland and the Western Isles, they established a presence that was at times dominant enough to replace the existing population substantially. The Norsemen had their own mythology, their own cosmology, their own relationship to the landscape, but they were not, as a rule, destroyers of ancient monuments. Norse place names in Orkney include references to the ancient stones. The Ring of Brodgar has a Norse name. Stenness has a Norse name. The Norsemen knew the monuments were there, and they incorporated them into their naming of the landscape, which suggests they recognized them as significant features rather than simply ignoring them. The Norse sagas contain references to standing stones as places of oath-taking, as boundary markers, as locations of legal and ceremonial significance. This may reflect Norse cultural practices, independent of the Neolithic tradition, but the coincidence of ancient stones being understood as places of particular significance by multiple successive cultures suggests that the places themselves, independent of any specific tradition's interpretation, carried a kind of weight that was perceived across cultural boundaries. The stones were there. They were old. They were clearly the product of enormous effort. They marked places, and that marking, whatever its original specific meaning, continued to be felt as meaningful by people who came to the landscape thousands of years after the stones were erected. The word ley line is one that archaeologists approach with considerable caution, and rightly so, because it has been associated with a great deal of speculative and sometimes, frankly, pseudoscientific thinking about the ancient monument landscape. The original idea, proposed by the amateur archaeologist Alfred Watkins in the 1920s, was that straight lines could be drawn through multiple ancient sites across the British landscape, suggesting that the sites were deliberately aligned with each other over long distances. Watkins called these lines leys, and his book The Old Straight Track became one of the founding texts of what has sometimes been called Earth Mysteries research. The professional archaeological community largely dismissed the ley line concept on the reasonable grounds that when you have a dense enough distribution of ancient sites, it is statistically inevitable that many of them will appear to align with each other by chance, and that Watkins's analysis did not adequately control for this. The concept was then taken up and elaborated by various writers who added increasingly speculative ideas about energy lines, earth energy, consciousness, and interdimensional portals, none of which have any evidential basis. And this elaboration further discredited the original observation in the eyes of mainstream archaeology. But here is the thing. The mainstream dismissal of Watkins's specific claims does not mean that the ancient monuments of Britain and Scotland were placed without regard to their relationships to each other. The evidence is quite clear that they were not. The relationship between the Ring of Brodgar, the stones of Stenness, Maeshowe, and the settlement at Barnhouse is not accidental. These monuments are clearly related to each other, aligned with each other, positioned to create a coherent ceremonial landscape in which movement between them was part of the experience of the monuments. The alignment of Callanise to specific horizon features and to the movements of the moon is not accidental. The consistent orientation of the recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire to the lunar sector is not accidental. Long-distance relationships between monuments, established through shared traditions and possibly through deliberate coordination, were real features of the Neolithic and Bronze Age landscape. The question is not whether the monuments relate to each other. They do. The question is how to describe and understand those relationships without falling into the trap of claiming more than the evidence supports. The answer is probably that the relationships between monuments were understood by the people who built them through a combination of practical knowledge, astronomical calculation, and a shared cosmological framework that is no longer available to us in its specifics, but whose broad outlines are recoverable from the monuments themselves. The people who built the Scottish standing stones were surveyors. They were astronomers. They were engineers. They were also something that modern categories do not quite have a word for, something that combines what we would now call priest, scientist, artist, and community leader in a single role. The person, or persons, who knew where to put the stone and what direction it should face, who had the knowledge of the sky and the landscape, and the tradition that allowed them to make those decisions with the confidence that the community would invest years of labor in their realization, was a specialist of a kind that no longer exists in the form it would have taken 5,000 years ago. We sometimes call this person a shaman, or a druid, or a wise woman. But all of those terms carry the associations of the traditions that later used them and distort our understanding of the Neolithic reality. What we can say is that there was specialized knowledge, that it was transmitted across generations, that it was held by specific individuals or groups within the community, and that it was the foundation of the monument-building tradition. The knowledge of where the sun set on the winter solstice was not simply common knowledge that any farmer could have. It was specialized knowledge that required training and practice to acquire and maintain. The person who knew it was valuable. The community invested in keeping that person alive and productive, and that investment produced the monuments. The island of Jura, in the Inner Hebrides, contains a group of standing stones at a place called Knock na Gael that have been so little studied that they barely appear in the standard literature. There are sites like this across Scotland, places where standing stones are present, but where no systematic study has been done, where the alignments have not been measured, where the local tradition has not been recorded, where the stones stand in fields or on hillsides, visited occasionally by walkers who note them in their diaries and then move on. Scotland's monument inventory is incomplete. The Canmore database, maintained by Historic Environment Scotland, contains records of thousands of prehistoric monuments, but the records are uneven. Some sites are well documented, many are not, and new sites continue to be discovered, sometimes through systematic aerial and LiDAR survey, sometimes through chance observations by people who simply notice something in a field that does not look quite natural, that has a slightly too regular shape, that is positioned slightly too deliberately relative to the landscape around it. LiDAR has been transformative for Scottish archaeology. The technology produces high-resolution three-dimensional maps of the landscape surface by measuring the reflection of laser pulses from aircraft, and it can see through vegetation cover, including through woodland canopies, to reveal the underlying topography. What LiDAR surveys of Scottish landscapes have revealed, and continue to reveal, is that the number of surviving ancient monuments is substantially larger than ground survey had suggested. Low earthworks, subtle depressions and banks, alignments of slight mounds that ground-level observation would miss entirely, are visible from the air in the LiDAR data. Archaeologists working through the growing archive of LiDAR coverage for Scotland are regularly finding new sites, new features, new connections between known sites that were not previously understood. The story of Scotland's ancient monument landscape is still being written. What we know now is more than what we knew 20 years ago. What we know in 20 years will be more than what we know now. The stones are still giving up their secrets. Slowly, in the way that stone gives up anything, but persistently. One of the more recent areas of active research is the relationship between the ancient monuments of Scotland and the ancient monuments of Ireland. The two countries are separated by the North Channel at their closest point, a stretch of water that is approximately 20 kilometers wide. In the Neolithic period, the sea was both a barrier and a highway. The people of Neolithic Scotland and Neolithic Ireland were not isolated from each other. There is evidence of shared material culture, shared monument types, shared artistic traditions. The passage tomb tradition of Ireland, most famously represented by the great monuments of the Boyne Valley, Newgrange, Knowth, and Douth, is closely related to the passage cairn tradition of Scotland and Orkney. The pottery found at Neolithic sites in both countries is similar enough to suggest either shared manufacturing traditions or actual movement of objects and people between the islands. The genetic evidence, when it is available for ancient samples from both countries, suggests a substantial degree of shared ancestry. The Atlantic coastal connection that brought Neolithic farmers from Iberia northward through France and Brittany reached both Ireland and Scotland, and the two populations that descended from those migrants maintained contact across the water for millennia. This connection matters for the Standing Stone story because it suggests that the tradition was not purely local. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the Scottish monuments was part of a broader Atlantic tradition that extended from Brittany northward through Britain and Ireland. The specific expressions of that tradition in Scotland were shaped by Scottish conditions, Scottish geography, Scottish social history, but the underlying knowledge and the underlying cosmological framework were shared across the Atlantic facade. The monuments of Stenach in Brittany, the most extensive stone row complex in the world with over 3,000 stones in multiple parallel rows extending for kilometres across the Breton landscape, date to approximately the same period as the earliest Scottish monuments. The tradition of astronomical monument building was already thousands of years old and geographically widespread when the first standing stones were erected in Scotland. What Scotland did was to receive and elaborate that tradition to a degree, and to maintain and continue it for a duration that was not replicated elsewhere. Scotland was not the origin of the tradition. It was the place where the tradition found its fullest and most sustained expression, and the question of why it found that expression here, rather than equally in Brittany or Ireland or Denmark, remains open and interesting. The climate of Scotland in the Neolithic period was different from the climate today. The Holocene climatic optimum, the warmest period of the current interglacial, peaked in Scotland roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, and the climate during the Neolithic, while perhaps marginally warmer and drier than today in some regions, was still variable and challenging. But the agricultural systems of Neolithic Scotland were apparently capable of supporting a population large enough to build the monuments, which means that the land was more productive than its current state would suggest. The deforestation and soil degradation that occurred during and after the Neolithic reduced Scotland's agricultural carrying capacity substantially. The treeless moorland landscapes that now characterize much of the Highland zone were once, in the Neolithic period, partly covered by forest, birch and hazel at higher elevations, oak and elm at lower elevations, forest that provided timber for building and for fuel, and for the management of the environment. The people of Neolithic Scotland were not living in the current landscape. They were living in a richer, more wooded, more productive landscape that the subsequent millennia of human activity progressively transformed into the open, often degraded environment that exists today. The monuments they left behind are more permanent than the landscape they built them in. They outlasted the forest. They outlasted the soil fertility. They outlasted the culture that built them. They are still there in a landscape that has changed out of all recognition, pointing at a sky that has not changed at all. The sky is the thing that links the builders most directly to the modern observer. When you stand in the ring of Brodgar at midsummer and watch the sun circle the sky without setting, because at Orkney's latitude near the summer solstice, the sun barely dips below the horizon before rising again, You are watching the same sun that the Neolithic builders watched. The geometry has not changed. The position of the sun relative to the horizon at the solstices, the position of the moon at its standstill, the angle of light at the equinoxes, all of these things are the same now as they were when the stones were placed. The monuments are not relics of a dead past that requires imaginative reconstruction. They are instruments that still work. Stand in the right place at the right time, and the monument tells you exactly what it was built to tell you. The sun enters the passage. The moon floats above the recumbent stone. The beam of light reaches the back wall of the chamber. The instrument still functions. 5,000 years of wind and rain and frost and the weight of accumulated time have not broken it. The knowledge encoded in the stone is still there, still accessible, still demonstrable to anyone willing to stand in the right place at the right time and look. There is something in that fact that the professional archaeological literature tends to underplay, perhaps out of appropriate caution about overinterpretation. The monuments work, they are functional, they encode real astronomical knowledge, and the effort required to make them work, to position a stone accurately enough that the sun enters a passage only at the solstice and at no other time, required knowledge and skill that we tend to attribute only to literate, formally educated, institutionally supported traditions of inquiry. The standing stones of Scotland are evidence that such knowledge and skill existed 5,000 years before any of those institutional supports were in place. That should be humbling. It should prompt us to revise our default assumptions about what kind of knowledge requires what kind of institutional context to develop and preserve. The people of Neolithic Scotland had no writing. They had no formal schools. They had no professional scientific institutions. They had stone and time, and the willingness to pay attention to the sky for generation after generation until they understood it well enough to build it into their landscape in permanent form. The darkness deserves to be taken seriously here, not as a metaphor, but as a physical reality. At my show, on the winter solstice, the interior of the chamber is completely dark. There is no light from outside. The passage is too long and angled in such a way that on most days of the year, no sunlight reaches the interior. The people who gathered inside my show on the days around the winter solstice, before the moment when the sunlight entered, were in complete darkness. They would have felt the weight of the earth around them, the cold of the stone, the low ceiling of the chamber, and then the light would have entered. The beam would have crossed the floor and reached the back wall, and the chamber would have been illuminated by a thin shaft of winter sunlight, red gold with the colour of low-angle winter sun, lasting only a few minutes before the sun moved past its alignment with the passage. What that experience would have meant to people who had been living through months of darkness and cold is not difficult to imagine. It was not a demonstration of astronomical knowledge for its own sake. It was an experience of hope, a physical, sensory, unmistakable demonstration that the darkness had its limits, that the light would return, that the turning had happened. The builders of my show built a chamber that delivered that experience every year to whoever was inside it on the right day. They built it in stone, so that it would keep delivering that experience to communities that came after them. This is an act of profound generosity across time. They were building for people they would never know, would never meet, could not have imagined in any specific detail. They were building for the future because they understood, in some way that transcended the individual lifetime, that the future needed to know what they knew. The great stones of Kilmartin Glen are not all circles. Some of them are single monoliths, solitary pillars rising from the flat floor of the valley, without obvious relation to a geometric pattern. One of the most famous is the stone known as Diarmaid's Grave, named after a hero of Gaelic mythology, a name given to it many centuries after its erection. What it was originally called, what the person who put it there called it, is not known. It stands in a field now, slightly tilted by millennia of frost and the slow movement of the valley floor, its surface covered with the orange and grey of lichen that has been colonizing it for centuries. There are cut marks on it, the same abstract symbols that appear on rock surfaces across Scotland, hammered into the stone's surface with deliberation. The cut marks predate the mythological name. They predate the Gaelic language that gave it that name. They are the first layer of meaning that we can directly observe, and they say something that we cannot read. The stone was placed at a specific point in the valley. The point is chosen. The view from it in multiple directions is to specific horizon features. Whether those features are astronomically significant has not been fully analysed. The analysis has not been done in the systematic way it deserves, because there are only so many archaeologists and so many resources, and Scotland has so many stones that the queue for systematic study is very long. The Kilmartin Glen stones are relatively well studied by Scottish standards. There are thousands of stones across Scotland that have received no systematic study at all. They stand in their fields and on their hillsides and wait. The waiting is one of the strangest qualities of the standing stones. They are extraordinarily patient. They have been through everything that Scotland has been through: Roman campaigns, Viking raids, clan wars, religious reformations, the Scottish Enlightenment, the clearances, the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars, the oil economy, the independence debate. All of it has washed past them, and they are still standing, still pointing in the directions they were positioned to point in, still encoding the knowledge their builders put into them. The farmers who ploughed around them, the shepherds who sheltered from the rain behind them, the children who climbed on them across generations, the tourists who photograph them now, all of it is a thin film of activity compared to the depth of time those stones have been there. They are the oldest things in Scotland that were made by human hands, older than any building, older than any text, older than any institution, older than any language now spoken in Scotland, including Gaelic, which arrived in Scotland from Ireland only in the early medieval period, a relative latecomer in the deep timeline of Scottish habitation. The Gaelic mythological tradition does contain a category of figure, the Seanachie or Seanchai, the keeper of tradition, the storyteller-historian, whose role was to preserve and transmit the community's accumulated knowledge of its past. These figures were professional in the medieval period, attached to noble families, specialists in genealogy and history and story. But the role they occupied was much older than the medieval period, and much older than the Gaelic language. Every tradition that has survived without writing has had figures who played this role, keepers of the knowledge, people who remembered what the monuments were for, who knew the stories attached to the alignments, who could tell you why a particular stone faced in a particular direction, and what happened when the sun touched it at the right time of year. Those people were the links in the chain that ran from the Neolithic builders to the Iron Age inhabitants to the historical Gaels. And the chain broke. At some point, probably gradually, probably not in a single catastrophic event, but through the accumulated pressures of demographic change, religious conversion, political disruption, and simple generational failure of transmission. The specific knowledge of what the monuments were built for became lost. The stories associated with them became the folk traditions of fairy hills and haunted places, and the footprints of giants. The specific astronomical knowledge became generalized into a sense that the stones were old and powerful and not to be trifled with. The detailed cosmic framework became the vaguer sense of the sacred that attaches to very old things in very old places. And then eventually even that became attenuated into the curiosity of archaeologists and the photographs of tourists. But the loss of the specific transmitted knowledge does not mean the loss of the monuments themselves. And the monuments, as the last century of archaeological analysis has demonstrated, are themselves a form of the knowledge. The knowledge is in the orientations. It is in the geometry. It is in the positioning relative to the landscape. You do not need the transmitted tradition to recover the astronomical facts, though you do need it to understand what those facts meant to the community that built the instruments. The astronomical facts are recoverable from the instruments because they are expressed in the physical relationships between stone and sky and landscape that have not changed. What has been lost is the interpretive framework, the specific cosmological and theological meaning that the community assigned to what they observed and built. And that loss is real and significant, but it is not total, because the monuments themselves are evidence not just of what was observed, but of how much it mattered. The scale of the effort is itself a kind of meaning. You build 90 stone circles in one region of northeast Scotland because the thing they are tracking matters to you on a level that justifies 90 stone circles. The mattering is encoded in the stone, as surely as the astronomical alignment is. The 19-year lunar cycle, the Metonic cycle, as it is known from the Greek astronomer Meton, who described it in the 5th century before the Common Era, is the period after which the moon's phases recur on the same day of the solar year. It is the period that reconciles the solar year and the lunar month. the two great natural cycles that any calendar system must balance. The fact that the builders of Highlands were tracking the major lunar standstill, which is closely related to the Metonic cycle, suggests that they understood the relationship between the solar and lunar calendars at a level of sophistication that was not independently documented in the written record until the ancient Greek world. This is not a coincidence that can be wished away. The Neolithic builders of Scotland had a working understanding of a relationship between celestial cycles that Greeks, with access to centuries of written astronomical records, were proud of discovering and codifying. The difference is that the Greeks wrote it down. The Scottish Neolithic people built it in stone. The knowledge is the same, the medium is different. And the stone medium has, in some ways, proven more durable. The ancient Greek astronomical manuscripts survived in a precarious chain of copying and translation that broke several times and was reconstructed with great difficulty. The standing stones of Scotland are still there, intact, accessible, measurable. The knowledge encoded in them has not faded. It has only been waiting for people with the right questions and the right tools to read it. The question of who first developed the understanding of the lunar standstill cycle and how that understanding was developed and transmitted to the builders of Highlands and the recumbent stone circles is one that may never be fully answerable. What we can say is that the tradition was old when the Scottish monuments were built. The megalithic monument tradition of the Atlantic facade of Europe was already several hundred years old by the time the first monuments were built in Scotland. The specific practices of astronomical alignment were already developed in Brittany and Ireland before they reached Scotland. Scotland received a sophisticated tradition and elaborated it further. How the knowledge was transmitted, through population movement, through trade networks, through the movement of specialist individuals who carried the knowledge with them, is not fully clear. Probably all of those mechanisms were involved. The important point is that the knowledge was not developed independently by isolated Scottish communities working without external input. It was part of a connected, continental-scale tradition of inquiry into the relationships between the earth and the sky, inquiry conducted across generations without writing, maintained through practice and transmission, and the permanent physical encoding of the results in stone. The philosophical implications of that fact deserve to be taken seriously. We are accustomed to thinking about the history of knowledge as a progressive accumulation, with each generation building on the written records of previous generations, knowledge growing steadily as the archive grows. This model of knowledge history makes writing the condition of significant knowledge growth. Before writing, this model implies knowledge was limited, local, fragile, easily lost. The Scottish standing stones contradict this model. They are evidence that sustained, systematic, multi-generational inquiry into complex relationships in the natural world was possible and was practiced in the complete absence of writing. The knowledge accumulated. The archive was the landscape itself, encoded in stone rather than in text, but no less real and no less accurate for that. What was lost was not the knowledge itself, which is still recoverable from the monuments, but the interpretive framework, the cosmological and theological context that gave the knowledge its meaning for the community that held it. The facts are still there. The meaning is harder to recover. But this tells us something important, not about the limitations of pre-literate knowledge systems, but about the different ways that meaning and knowledge can be embedded in human cultures and in human landscapes. Writing is one way. Stone is another. Both can last. Both can be lost. The stone has actually outlasted the writing in Scotland's case. The monuments are here. Many of the manuscripts that could have told us what the monuments meant are gone. Across the Scottish countryside, in places that require some effort to reach, that involve a walk across rough ground or a negotiation with a farmer for access to a field, there are standing stones that have not been visited by an archaeologist in decades. They are recorded in the national database. Their GPS coordinates are noted. Their approximate date range is guessed at based on type and context. And then they stand, unremarked and unstudied, in their fields and on their hillsides for another decade or two, until someone with time and resources makes their way to them with a measuring tape and a transit level and begins to work out what they are pointing at. The queue of unstudied sites in Scotland is very long. The resources for archaeological fieldwork in Scotland are not plentiful. The monuments are patient. They will wait. They have been waiting for a long time. and they are not in a hurry. But the researchers who might study them are not patient in the same way. The archive of traditional knowledge that might illuminate the monuments continues to shrink as the generations who carried fragments of it die. The window for combining the physical evidence of the monuments with the oral traditional knowledge of the communities that have lived with them for millennia is narrowing. The collaboration between archaeologists and the communities that hold traditional landscape knowledge is increasingly recognized as one of the most productive methodological approaches available. In Scotland, as in other places where ancient monument landscapes are dense, the living landscape knowledge of farmers who have worked the land for generations, of people who know the local names for the stones, who know the stories attached to them, who know which fields flood in winter and which hillsides face the morning sun, is a form of evidence that has been seriously underutilized by professional archaeology. The monuments do not exist in isolation. They exist in landscapes that have been continuously inhabited and shaped for thousands of years, and the communities that inhabit those landscapes carry knowledge about them that no survey or excavation can independently generate. The academic debates about the purpose of the standing stones continue. The astronomical alignment argument, developed over the last century and a half from the pioneering work of Alexander Thom through to the more recent work of Clive Ruggles and others, is now broadly accepted in its general outlines, though the degree of astronomical precision attributable to different monuments is still debated. The social function argument, developed through the work of scholars like Mike Parker Pearson and the Stonehenge Riverside Project team, has added important dimensions to the understanding of how the monuments were used as places of communal gathering and feasting and ritual. The landscape archaeology approach, developed through the phenomenological work of Christopher Tilley and others, has enriched the understanding of how the monuments were positioned relative to the wider landscape and to each other. No single approach captures the whole picture. The monuments were built for multiple purposes, understood at multiple levels, used in multiple ways by communities whose concerns were at once practical and cosmological, social and individual, directed toward the past and the present and the future simultaneously. They were calendar systems and communal gathering places, and expressions of cosmological conviction and landscape navigational aids and markers of territorial identity and memorials to the dead and instruments of communal self-constitution. They were all of these things at once, because the communities that built them were not divided into the specialized departments of knowledge that modern institutional life has created. Their knowledge was integrated. Their monuments expressed that integration. The integration is visible in the monuments themselves. A stone circle that is positioned on a ridge from which multiple valleys are visible, that is astronomically aligned to the winter solstice sunset, that contains internal deposits of animal bone suggesting communal feasting, that is built from stones, quarried from a site 20 kilometers away, whose geological character was understood and chosen for specific reasons, that is positioned at the head of a routeway that connects multiple communities across a landscape, that is visible from a dozen other monument sites on the surrounding hills, that contains carved cut marks on its internal stone surfaces, whose meaning we cannot read, but whose presence indicates a tradition of symbolic marking that extended far beyond this single site. Such a monument does not have a single function that explains it. It has a whole world that built it, a world in which the practical and the symbolic, the individual and the communal, the moment and the millennium, were not separated but were understood as aspects of a single reality that the monument helped its community to inhabit. The monument is the node of a network. The network is the culture. And the culture built 500 stone circles and thousands of standing stones across Scotland because the network was that extensive and the commitment to marking it in stone was that deep. There is a farmer in Orkney who has a standing stone in the middle of one of his fields. He ploughs around it every spring. His father ploughed around it. His grandfather ploughed around it. The stone has been there since before anyone in his family can remember. Since before anyone in any family can remember. Since before anyone whose name is known was alive. The stone has no name in any database because it is too small and too unremarkable to have attracted systematic study. It is one of thousands. But it is there, in the middle of a field that has been farmed for at least 1,000 years, quite probably longer, and it is still standing, because every generation that has farmed that field has chosen to let it stand. Not because there is a law requiring it, though there is, not because there is a financial incentive to preserve it, though there sometimes is, but because the stone is there and it has always been there, and the reasons to remove it have never been quite compelling enough to overcome the sense, transmitted through the generations in ways that are more felt than articulated, that this is a stone that should not be disturbed. That sense is the last living trace of what the stone meant when it was placed. The specific meaning is gone. The transmitted feeling, the sense of significance, the awareness that this is not just any rock, but a placed rock, a deliberate rock, a rock that someone put here for a reason that mattered, has persisted through all the centuries of farming, and all the changes of belief, and all the renamings and renegotiations of landscape meaning that Scottish history has involved. The feeling is thinner than it once was. It is much less specific, but it is still there. And while it is there, the stone will probably still stand. There are places in Scotland where you can stand among the stones at the right time of day in the right season and feel what the builders might have been reaching for. Not the specific cosmological content, not the precise theological interpretation. Those are gone. But the experience of standing in a circle of stones that has been standing for 5,000 years, in a landscape that was old when the stones were placed and has continued to age without the stones aging with it, in a light that falls on the stone and on the heather and on the distant water in a way that is recognizably Scottish and recognizably ancient, even to someone who has never been to Scotland before, produces a kind of awareness that is not easy to name in modern categories. It is not religious in any specific doctrinal sense. It is not aesthetic in the way that art appreciation is aesthetic. It is something more fundamental, a sense of scale, of duration, of the smallness of any individual human life against the backdrop of the time that the stones have been there and the time that the sky above them has been doing what the sky does. The stone is patient. The sky is indifferent. The human standing between them is brief. And in that briefness, in that awareness of briefness, something opens up that the builders of the monuments were trying to keep open, the awareness of scale, the experience of standing at the edge of something very large, the recognition that the cycles that mattered to the Neolithic community are still going. The sun still rises and sets at the same angles that the monuments frame. The moon still makes its circuit. The stars that the builders watched are still there, their positions shifted by the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, the process called precession. But the great patterns still visible, still rising and setting, still making their grand annual circuit around the sky. The universe has not changed. Only the community that was tracking it has gone. And the stones, placed by that community to help it track, remain. The tracking continues, not in the same form, not with the same cosmological framework, but the impulse to understand the relationship between human existence and the larger patterns of the cosmos, which drove the building of the Scottish standing stones, is not gone. It has found different expressions. The astronomical tradition that the Neolithic builders of Scotland helped to develop did not end with the Bronze Age. It was transmitted, transformed, and elaborated, through channels that are difficult to trace precisely, but are demonstrably real, into the astronomical traditions of the historical world. The careful observation of celestial patterns that the builders of Callanise and the recumbent stone circles practiced was a form of the same activity that Babylonian astronomers systematized in writing, that Greek astronomers formalized in mathematical models, that medieval Islamic astronomers elaborated and transmitted to Renaissance Europe, that Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler and Newton transformed into the scientific framework through which we now understand the cosmos. The specific knowledge of the Neolithic astronomers was not directly transmitted. The tradition broke, but the impulse, the basic human drive to watch the sky and understand its patterns and build that understanding into permanent form, did not break. It persisted. It found new forms. And it produced, eventually, the tradition of inquiry that has taken us to the moon and sent probes to the edge of the solar system and mapped the cosmic microwave background radiation left over from the origin of the universe. There is a line, tenuous and indirect, but real, from the person who positioned the recumbent stone in Aberdeenshire to watch the moon, to the astronomer who trained the Hubble Space Telescope on the deep field and counted the galaxies. The line is not direct. It is not simple. But the impulse is the same. The need to understand what the sky is doing and what it means. The commitment to building that understanding in the most permanent form available. Scotland built it in stone. We build it in mathematics. The scale is different. The commitment is the same. 5,000 stones in a country the size of South Carolina, planted over 5,000 years, by people whose names are gone, whose language is gone, whose specific beliefs are gone, but whose work is still here, still pointing at the sky, still encoding the knowledge they accumulated over generations of patient watching. The dark reason that Scotland has more standing stones than any country in Europe is not dark at all, once you look at it clearly. It is a reason that is large and patient and committed and illuminated by the same light that the stones themselves were built to frame. Scotland had the sky, Scotland had the time, Scotland had the people who were willing to build what they understood into permanent stone so that the people who came after them would not have to start again from nothing. They built a library. The books are the stones. The language is orientation and alignment, and the movement of light across a specific surface at a specific time of year. It is still readable. It has been waiting for readers for a very long time. And the reading, as anyone who has stood in the ring of Brodgar on a clear Orcadian evening, watching the sky turn slowly overhead, will tell you, is not merely academic. It is something else. Something that does not have a clean modern name. Something that the people who placed those stones 5,000 years ago would probably recognize, even across the gulf of time and language and belief, as the thing they were trying to give to whoever came after them. The awareness of the sky, the sense of the cycles, the knowledge, held in the bones rather than in the mind, that the light comes back. It always has. And the stones, patient and permanent in their fields and on their hillsides, are still here to show you exactly when. The water that collects in the hollow of a cup mark on a Neolithic standing stone reflects the sky. It has been doing this for 5,000 years. Not continuously, because it dries up in dry weather and overflows in heavy rain, but persistently, returning to hold a small circle of sky in the hollow whenever conditions allow. The person who carved that hollow knew it would do that. They had seen it happen in other hollows, in other rocks. They chose to make more of them. Whether the reflected sky was the purpose of the cup mark, or one of its properties, or simply a pleasing accident, is not something we can determine. But the fact that people 5,000 years ago were thinking carefully enough about the relationship between stone and water and sky to create features that held sky and stone is itself a kind of statement. The world was not divided for them the way it is divided for us. The sky was not above, and the earth was not below, in the simple vertical sense that our modern categories imply. The sky was in the stone, in the water in the stone, in the light that fell on the stone and illuminated its carved surfaces. The earth was in the sky because the knowledge of the earth's seasons was derived from watching the sky and was encoded back into the earth in the form of the monuments. Everything was connected. The monuments made the connections visible. And the connections, like the stones themselves, have proven remarkably durable. They are still there. The sky is still in the water in the hollow. The light still falls on the carved surface at the right angle at the right time of year. The stone is still pointing at the same horizon it was pointing at when someone, whose name we will never know, placed it there with great care and great intention, and the hope, perhaps, that whoever came after would understand what it was saying. Some of us are still trying to understand. The stone is patient. It will wait while we work it out. There is a hillside in Perthshire where a single standing stone rises from rough grazing ground at an elevation that gives it a view in every direction. No trees obstruct the horizon. From this stone, on clear days, you can see mountain ranges that are 40 kilometers away. You can watch the sun set behind specific summits in specific weeks of the year. You can see, if you are patient enough and the weather allows, the moon rise above a notch in a ridge to the southeast, in a position that corresponds to a significant point in its cycle. The view from this stone is not accidental. It could not be accidental. The site was chosen precisely because it offers these sight lines, because the view it commands covers the relevant portions of the horizon where the celestial markers appear. Whoever stood here when the stone was being positioned, using whatever instruments they had, which were probably nothing more complex than aligned poles and a careful eye trained across years of practice, understood exactly what the stone would be able to see from this hillside. They put it here so that the stone could see those things, so that the stone could be a point from which the sky was legible. And then they moved on, or they died, and the stone continued to watch the sky without them. That is perhaps the most affecting quality of the standing stones. They outlasted their makers so completely that not even the names of the people who placed them survive. The names of individual pharaohs from the same period in Egypt are known. The names of kings in Mesopotamia from the same era are recorded in cuneiform on clay tablets in museum collections. But the person who positioned the Perthshire stone, who knew exactly which hillside to choose, who had the practical and astronomical knowledge to place the stone precisely where it needed to be, is as anonymous as the wind. They left nothing that bears their name. They left only the work. And the work is so well done that it has endured for 5,000 years in a climate that tests stone and soil alike every winter. Whatever else can be said about the builders of the Scottish standing stones, their craft has proven its quality in the most exacting way possible: time. The tradition of building in stone was not simply a practical choice. There were practical reasons to prefer stone. It does not rot, it does not burn. It is heavy enough that casual disturbance is difficult. A standing stone placed in the ground with proper care will stand, in most geological conditions, for thousands of years without any maintenance. The builders knew this. They chose stone specifically because they wanted permanence. They wanted the monument to outlast them. They wanted it to outlast the community of people who built it. They wanted it to still be pointing at the sky when people who did not know them and had never heard their language came to stand beside it. Whether they could have imagined quite how thoroughly their descendants and successors would lose the specific knowledge of what the stones were for is another question. But the choice of stone was a choice about time, a commitment to a timescale that exceeded any individual life or any community's continuity, a decision to speak to the future, even when the future was unknowable. That commitment is itself a kind of knowledge. The knowledge that the sky would still be doing what the sky was doing when the stone was placed, that the relationship between the stone's orientation and the sky's cycles would remain valid as long as the stone stood, required an understanding of permanence and cycle that is not trivial. The builders understood that the patterns they were encoding would not change. The moon's standstill cycle will continue for as long as the moon exists. The solstice will continue to occur at the same angle and position as long as the Earth continues to orbit the Sun. The knowledge encoded in the monuments is not perishable in the way that knowledge written on organic materials is perishable. It was built into geometry, into the angle at which stone meets sky, and geometry does not decay. The Alexander Thom story is worth telling properly, because it illustrates the way in which the standing stones force a confrontation with assumptions about who can know what and how. Alexander Thom was a Scottish engineer, a professor of engineering science at Oxford in the mid-20th century, who spent his entire adult life measuring the stone circles and standing stones of Britain and Scotland in his spare time. He was not a trained archaeologist. He was an engineer. And his approach to the monuments was an engineer's approach. He measured them with extraordinary precision, recording the positions and orientations of thousands of stones across hundreds of sites over several decades, and he then applied statistical analysis to the results to identify patterns in the orientations and the geometry. What he found, and what he published in two major books in the 1960s and 70s, was that the monuments displayed a degree of astronomical precision and geometric sophistication that the archaeological mainstream of the time was completely unprepared to accept. His analysis suggested that the builders of the stone circles had used a standard unit of measurement, which he called the megalithic yard, approximately 83 centimeters, across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers. It suggested that the astronomical alignments were not approximate but precise, capable of indicating specific astronomical events to within a fraction of a degree. It suggested that the builders had a knowledge of Euclidean geometry, of Pythagorean triples, of the complex mathematics of ellipses, that was not supposed to exist in pre-literate Bronze Age Britain. The archaeological establishment resisted these conclusions vigorously. Some of the resistance was legitimate. Some of Thom's statistical methods were open to criticism. The case for the megalithic yard as a universal standard has been debated extensively and remains unresolved. But the core of his argument, that the astronomical alignments of the Scottish stone circles were real, deliberate, and significantly more precise than a casual placement would produce, has substantially survived the critical scrutiny it received and has been broadly accepted by a generation of researchers who have built on his work. Clive Ruggles, who began as a critical skeptic of Thom's methods and applied much more rigorous statistical analysis to the question, concluded that the astronomical alignments were real at a statistically significant level, even under the most conservative interpretation of the data. The monuments were astronomically oriented. Not perfectly, not with a precision that would satisfy a modern surveying instrument, but consistently, deliberately, and with a degree of accuracy that required deliberate effort to achieve. Tom was right about the alignments, even if some of the detail of his argument required revision. And the manner in which his work was initially received, the instinctive resistance from trained archaeologists to the suggestion that Bronze Age monument builders in Scotland had sophisticated astronomical and geometric knowledge, illustrates the difficulty of updating assumptions about what pre-literate people were capable of. The assumption was that sophistication of this kind required literacy, required formal institutions, required the kind of accumulated written knowledge that characterizes the civilizations of the historical period. The Scottish standing stones are evidence that the assumption is wrong. Sophistication of a high order can be accumulated, transmitted, and expressed without any of those institutional supports. It requires only what the Neolithic and Bronze Age builders of Scotland demonstrably had: time, attention, and the commitment to build what you understand in the most permanent form available. The Isle of Arran, in the Firth of Clyde off the west coast of Scotland, is sometimes called Scotland in miniature. It has Highland scenery in its northern half and gentler lowland topography in the south. It is accessible by ferry and is a popular destination for visitors who want a compressed experience of the Scottish landscape. And it has Macri Moor. The Macri Moor stone circles are a cluster of monument sites on a flat, peat-covered plateau in the middle of the island that has been in use since at least 4,000 years before the Common Era. There are 6 stone circles on the moor, of different sizes and different stone types, clearly the product of different episodes of construction across a long period. Some are built from red sandstone pillars, tall and slender. Some are built from rounded granite boulders. Some have the remains of earlier wooden circles beneath them, the post holes of timber monuments that predated the stone erection, the stones replacing an earlier tradition that was apparently felt to be less permanent than desired. The variety on Macri Moor makes it one of the most informative monument sites in Scotland, because the variation between the circles allows you to see the tradition developing, changing, responding to new ideas or new social conditions, while maintaining a commitment to the same basic landscape and the same basic purpose. The moor has been a ceremonial landscape for 6,000 years. The monuments have changed, the moor has not. The commitment to this specific piece of ground has been maintained across a span of time that is staggering, even in the context of Scottish prehistory's generally staggering timescales. Why this moor specifically? The question of site selection is one of the most interesting in Scottish monument studies. Why did communities choose specific locations, out of all the available ground, to invest in monumentalizing? The astronomical argument provides part of the answer. You choose a site that gives you the right sightlines. But the astronomical argument does not fully explain why some locations attracted monument after monument over thousands of years, while other, apparently similar locations attracted nothing. There must be something about the sites that the builders recognized as significant before they began to build, something that motivated the initial choice, and then made the site a place that subsequent communities felt compelled to add to rather than abandon. What that something was, for Macri Moor, or for Kilmartin Glen, or for the Callanise Peninsula, or for the Orkney complex, is not fully clear. The landscape archaeology approach suggests that it was the specific perceptual qualities of the site, the way it sits in the landscape, the views it commands, the sounds it gathers, the light it receives at different times of day and year. The processional approach suggests that it was the site's position in the network of routes through the landscape, the way it serves as a node connecting multiple territories and communities. The cosmological approach suggests that it was the site's alignment with specific features of the sky, as seen from this particular ground. All of these are probably part of the answer. The sites that attracted monuments were places that were already felt to be special, already understood as places where the relationship between the earth and the sky and the human community was particularly clear or particularly charged. The monuments made that special quality visible and permanent, but they did not create it. They recognized it. The recognition of significance in place is one of the deepest and most universal human experiences. Every culture, in every period, has had its sacred places, its significant landscapes, its spots on the earth where the relationship between the human and the larger universe was felt to be particularly immediate and particularly legible. The locations of these places are not random. They are chosen for reasons that combine the practical, the aesthetic, and the what might be called spiritual into a response to the specific qualities of the site that resists simple categorization. A mountain summit commands a view and commands a sense of exposure to the sky, and commands a sense of having risen above the ordinary level of human activity in a way that is simultaneously practical, perceptual, and something more. A spring where water emerges from the ground is a practical resource and a perceptual curiosity, and a demonstration that the earth contains things that the surface does not reveal, which suggests, to a mind inclined to see the landscape as animate, that the earth has an interior life. The standing stones of Scotland are placed in these kinds of significant locations, locations that were already felt to be meaningful before any stone was erected, and the erection of the stone was the community's way of acknowledging and amplifying that meaning. The stone says here, "This matters, remember this, we recognize this, and we are telling you so you will recognize it too." The archaeology of death in Neolithic and Bronze Age Scotland provides another window into the worldview that produced the standing stones. The treatment of the dead was elaborate, extended, and clearly embedded in a cosmological framework that is still partially recoverable even at 5,000 years remove. In the earliest Neolithic, the dead were placed in communal chambered cairns, their bones sometimes kept for years before final deposition, sometimes removed and rearranged, sometimes selected and curated in ways that suggest the individual remains were distinguished from each other rather than treated as a collective. This is not simply burial, this is an ongoing relationship with the dead. The dead were present, they were available. The chamber could be reopened, the bones handled. The dead participated in rituals involving the living. Whatever specific beliefs this represents, the broad outline is of a world in which the boundary between the living and the dead was permeable, in which the dead retained a kind of agency or significance within the community of the living, and in which the appropriate handling of the dead was a matter of considerable importance that required architectural investment on a scale that rivaled anything built for the living. The chambered cairns are not afterthoughts. They are primary monuments. The community invested more effort in building homes for its dead than it appears to have invested in building homes for its living. This tells us something fundamental about the relative value placed on different kinds of relationship in Neolithic Scotland. The relationship with the dead and with the past was valued as highly as or higher than the relationship with the living. The stones that marked those places of the dead were part of the same system of value. They all said the same thing, in different registers. This matters, remember. As the Bronze Age developed and the social organisation of Scotland changed, the treatment of the dead changed too. The elaborate communal burial chambers gave way to individual burial mounds, cist graves, the placing of a single person under a carefully constructed stone box in the earth. The shift from communal to individual burial is one of the most significant social changes that archaeology can observe in prehistoric Scotland, and it corresponds roughly to the demographic change associated with the influx of steppe ancestry population around 2,500 years before the Common Era. The newcomers brought with them different ideas about how the dead should be treated, ideas that emphasized individual identity and individual status rather than communal inclusion. The round barrows and the cist graves that proliferate across the Scottish landscape from the early Bronze Age onward are expressions of a social world in which the individual mattered in death in a way that the Neolithic communal cairn does not recognize. This shift did not eliminate the standing stone tradition. It continued alongside and interacted with the new burial practices. Bronze Age cist graves are sometimes found associated with standing stones. The standing stones of the Bronze Age sometimes contain or overlay earlier burials. The landscape of the dead and the landscape of astronomical observation were not separate. They were the same landscape, interpreted through the same cosmological framework, even as that framework was being reshaped by the social and demographic changes of the period. The cremation tradition that developed in the mid-Bronze Age added another dimension. Cremated remains began to appear in monuments that had been in use for centuries, inserted into stone circles, buried beneath standing stones, deposited in cairns that had originally been built for different purposes. The burning of the body is itself a dramatic ritual transformation, and its association with monument sites suggests that the monuments were understood as appropriate places to effect such transformations, places where the boundary between different states of being was already understood to be thinner than elsewhere. The fire that consumed the body and the astronomy that the monument was built to observe were not, in this framework, separate activities pointing towards separate concerns. They were both aspects of a single engagement with the question of cycles, of transformation, of what passes away and what returns. The dead enter the fire transforms them. The transformed remains are placed in the monument. The monument points at the sky cycles, the light returns. The connections were not metaphorical, they were literal. The cosmological framework in which the monuments were built was one in which these connections were real aspects of a real world, not poetic associations, but actual relationships between things that were understood to belong together. The Druids are sometimes invoked in popular accounts of the Scottish standing stones, usually to explain them, which is chronologically impossible since the Druidic tradition, as it can be documented or inferred, belongs to the Iron Age, 2,000 years or more after the Neolithic builders erected the first monuments. The Druids did not build Stonehenge. They did not build Callanise. They did not build the Ring of Brodgar. The Iron Age Celtic cultures of Britain and Ireland inherited a landscape that was already ancient, already monumentalized, already astronomically organized. What they did with that inherited landscape is a genuine question. The Iron Age peoples of Scotland, like their Neolithic and Bronze Age predecessors, clearly did not simply ignore the ancient monuments. Some were reused, some were incorporated into Iron Age activity, some were avoided in ways that suggest they were understood to have a significance that made them inappropriate for casual use. The Druidic tradition, insofar as it can be reconstructed from the fragmentary ancient sources and from the material evidence, appears to have maintained sophisticated astronomical knowledge of its own, knowledge that was probably partly derived through the long chains of oral transmission that sustained knowledge in pre-literate societies from the earlier monument-building traditions. The Druids did not build the Scottish standing stones, but they may have been among the last people who understood, even in transformed and partial form, what the stones were built to do. The Roman destruction of Druidic learning at Anglesey in 60 CE, the burning of the sacred groves, and the killing of the Druids who maintained the oral tradition of insular Celtic learning, was one of the most significant intellectual losses in European history. Whatever the Druids knew, whatever their astronomical knowledge, whatever their understanding of the ancient monument landscape and its significance, a large part of it died on Anglesey when the Roman legions came across the Menai Strait. Scotland was not directly affected by this event in the same way. The Druidic tradition persisted longer in the regions beyond direct Roman control, and Caledonia was never fully within Roman control. But the broader disruption of the Iron Age Celtic world by Roman expansion had effects that reached even into the areas Rome never directly conquered, through trade, through migration, through the displacement of peoples, through the broader transformation of the social and political landscape of Britain that Roman presence produced over 4 centuries. Whatever specific knowledge of the ancient monuments survived in the Iron Age cultures of Scotland was likely attenuated by the upheavals of the Roman period and the subsequent post-Roman disruptions of the Pictish and early medieval era. The chain of transmission was fraying long before it broke entirely. The early Christian missionaries who came to Scotland in the 6th century, Columba from Ireland to Iona, Aidan from Iona to Lindisfarne, the numerous unnamed monks who established the network of monastic communities that Christianized Scotland over the following century, encountered a landscape saturated with ancient monuments and a population that still had living folk relationships with those monuments. The Church's approach to the ancient sacred landscape of Scotland was not uniformly destructive. There were moments of destruction, of deliberate dismantling or incorporation of ancient sites into Christian use. There were carved crosses placed on standing stones, claiming the ancient significance of the location for the new faith. There were monastic communities established at or near ancient monument sites, inheriting the landscape significance of those sites within a new interpretive framework. The conversion of Scotland to Christianity was not a simple replacement of one tradition by another. It was a complex negotiation between new beliefs and old landscapes, in which the ancient monuments played a role as markers of landscape significance that was too deep and too persistent to simply be erased. The Church in Scotland learned to live with the stones, as Scotland has always learned to live with its stones. The post-medieval period brought new challenges. The Scottish Enlightenment of the 18th century produced a wave of interest in the ancient monuments that was simultaneously enthusiastic and damaging. Early antiquarians, armed with shovels and a burning curiosity about the past, excavated numerous standing stone sites with methods that, by modern standards, are catastrophic. Context was destroyed. Deposits that would have yielded important information were removed without adequate recording. Objects that could have been studied were sometimes removed without record of their provenance. The antiquarian excavations of the 18th and early 19th centuries destroyed a significant body of evidence that will never be recovered, but they also recorded things that would otherwise have been lost. Some of the early accounts of sites that have since been heavily damaged or partially destroyed preserve information about them that no later excavation could recover. The relationship between the destruction of evidence and the preservation of evidence in the antiquarian period is complicated and worth acknowledging honestly. The damage was real. So was the contribution. The land improvement movement of the same period was more straightforwardly destructive. As Scottish landlords, in the wake of the clearances and the enclosure of common land, sought to maximize agricultural productivity from their estates, standing stones that occupied potentially productive ground were removed and used as building material. Cairns were quarried for the stones that built field walls and farm buildings. The standing stone that now serves as a lintel over a doorway in a Perthshire farmhouse may have spent 4,000 years upright in a field before being repurposed in the 18th or 19th century. Nobody kept systematic records of what was removed. Nobody counted the stones before they came down. The loss is irreversible and its scale is unknown. What we have now is what survived that wave of agricultural modernization, plus what survived the more general attrition of the intervening centuries. The 500 stone circles and the thousands of individual standing stones that appear in the current records represent the survivors of a monument landscape that was once denser than any survey can now measure. The protection of what remains is now significantly better than it was. Historic Environment Scotland maintains the national record of ancient monuments and has legal powers to prevent the disturbance of scheduled ancient monuments, of which there are over 8,000 in Scotland. Planning law requires that development proposals in the vicinity of scheduled monuments undergo archaeological assessment. The heritage protection framework is not perfect, and sites continue to be damaged by agricultural activity, by development, by vandalism, and by the simple physical processes of erosion and settlement. But the systematic destruction of the antiquarian and land improvement periods is not happening in the same way today. The monuments that survive are, for the most part, monitored and at least nominally protected. The work of protecting them is ongoing and resource-constrained, but it is happening, and alongside the protection, the research continues. New excavations, conducted with modern methods that extract the maximum possible information from the minimum necessary disturbance, are adding to the understanding of the monuments every year. New survey technologies, LiDAR, ground-penetrating radar, optically stimulated luminescence dating, ancient DNA analysis, stable isotope analysis of human and animal remains, are opening new windows on the lives and beliefs of the people who built the monuments. The story is not complete. It is still being assembled. But it is considerably more complete than it was 20 years ago, and considerably less complete than it will be 20 years from now. The island of Islay, southernmost of the Inner Hebrides, is best known in the 21st century for its whiskey distilleries. It produces some of the most distinctive single malt whiskies in the world, characterized by a peaty, smoky quality that comes from the use of locally cut peat to dry the malted barley. The peat of Islay is very old. Some of it was beginning to form when the standing stones of Scotland were being built. The island has monuments of its own, standing stones and a stone circle at Cultoon, positioned on a headland that overlooks the sound separating Islay from Jura. The Cultoon circle has been studied and its astronomical alignments have been measured. It faces the winter solstice sunset. The light of the shortest day's sun reaches the interior of the circle through an alignment that was clearly deliberate. And the people who built it, 5,000 years ago, were living in a landscape that included the peat bog that was beginning to form even then, cutting the same peat that the whiskey distilleries now use, their lives shaped by the same Atlantic weather systems that still govern the island's character today. The whiskey is new, the peat and the weather and the stones are old. The island is continuous. The standing stones near the village of Kildonan on Arran face the summit of a mountain on the Kintyre Peninsula, visible across the water to the south. At midsummer, the sun sets directly behind that summit, as seen from the stones, creating a visual alignment between the monument and the distant geography that is too precise to be accidental. The builders of those stones knew the mountain. They measured its position on the horizon, carefully enough to orient the monument toward it. They understood that the relationship between their stone and that distant peak had an astronomical significance, that the sunset alignment was not simply a coincidence of geography, but a meaningful relationship between the landscape and the sky. They built that understanding into the monument. And now, 5,000 years later, on summer solstice evenings, the sun still sets behind the same mountain as seen from the same stones. The relationship still works. The knowledge is still there, encoded in the angle between the stones and the distant summit, waiting for anyone who knows how to read it. Reading the stones is an act of humility. It requires the admission that people who had none of the institutional apparatus that we associate with systematic knowledge were doing something that required systematic knowledge, and doing it well enough that the results are still verifiable 5,000 years later. It requires the admission that the assumption of progressive sophistication, the idea that we know more than our predecessors, and that our predecessors were less capable of complex thought than we are, is not simply wrong in the abstract, but demonstrably wrong in the specific case of the astronomical and engineering knowledge encoded in the Scottish standing stones. The builders of those stones knew things that we have had to rediscover with instruments they did not have. They knew the precise angle of the summer solstice sunrise. They knew the position of the moon at its major standstill. They knew the geometry of ellipses and how to construct circles of specific diameters from specific numbers of stones. They built this knowledge into the landscape in permanent stone, and the knowledge is still there, still accessible to anyone willing to look, still accurate in every respect that can be verified. Humility is the appropriate response. Not reverence in the religious sense, though the monuments invite that too, but intellectual humility. The recognition that the capacity for systematic, sustained, multi-generational inquiry into the patterns of the natural world is not a product of civilization. It is a product of being human. It is what humans do when they have the time and the attention and the commitment to do it. Scotland's prehistoric inhabitants had all three, and they left the evidence of it standing in every county of their country, pointing at a sky that has not changed. The question this story begins with, why does Scotland have more standing stones than any country in Europe, leads eventually to a place that is not really a question at all. It leads to a recognition. Scotland has more standing stones than any country in Europe, because Scotland's prehistoric inhabitants, over 5,000 years, built more of them. They built more of them because the tradition of building them was deeper and more persistent in Scotland than elsewhere. The tradition was deeper and more persistent because the conditions that sustained it, the geographic extremes that made astronomical tracking urgent, the Atlantic maritime connections that kept the tradition alive and shared across communities, the specific cultural elaborations that turned lunar observation into 90 recumbent stone circles in Aberdeenshire were more fully present in Scotland than in other places. And beneath all of those specific conditions is the general condition. The people were here. They were paying attention, and what they saw in the sky, in the landscape, in the turning of the seasons, mattered to them enough to build in stone. 5,000 stones, 5,000 years, 5,000 individual decisions to take what was understood and make it permanent. The stones are still pointing at the sky. Some of them lean now, tilted by frost and the movement of wet ground beneath them, but most of them still stand approximately where their builders intended them to stand. The sky they point at is the same sky. The cycles they track are still cycling. The knowledge they encode is still readable. And the people who built them, whose names are gone, and whose language is gone, and whose specific beliefs are gone, left something behind that has outlasted everything else about them. They left the work. They left the aligned stones in the landscape that they chose and loved and lived in and tried, in the most permanent way they knew how, to tell the future about. The future is us. We are still trying to hear what they said. The standing stones of Scotland are the longest conversation in the history of Britain. It began 6,000 years ago with the first Neolithic settlers who looked at the landscape and the sky and decided that what they saw was worth building around. It continued through the Bronze Age elaboration of the astronomical tradition, through the Iron Age peoples who lived among the monuments without fully understanding them, through the medieval Christians who built crosses on them, through the Enlightenment antiquarians who dug them up, through the improving landlords who knocked some of them down, through the 20th century archaeologists who began to understand them again, to the present day, when the Ring of Brodgar stands in the Orcadian evening light, and the tourists who stand inside it feel something that they cannot quite name and do not quite understand, but that is real enough that they come from the Orkneyingletes, other side of the world, to feel it. The conversation is in the stones. It is still going. The sky they were built to watch is still above them. The cycles they encode are still cycling. And if you stand in the right place at the right time and look in the right direction, the stones will still tell you what their builders built them to say. The light is coming back. It always has. The turning has happened. The year is turning. The cycles persist. You are here. This matters. Remember. That is the whole conversation. That is the reason for 500 stone circles and thousands of standing stones in a country the size of South Carolina. It is not mysterious in the way that mystery is usually understood. It is not hidden or suppressed or lost in the way that some accounts of ancient knowledge suggest. It is right there, visible in the orientations, readable in the geometry, accessible to anyone with a clear night and a willingness to stand in a field and watch the sky from the place the builders chose. The knowledge is in the stones. The stones are in Scotland, and Scotland is where they will remain, patient and permanent, for as long as there is a Scotland to hold them. 5,000 years have passed. They are still standing. The sky is still above them. What the builders wanted the future to know, the future still has the chance to learn. The stones are waiting. They have always been waiting. They are waiting now. When the last of the long evenings of summer drains away over the western horizon in the outer Hebrides, and the dark that never fully arrives in June begins its slow return toward the proper darkness of autumn, the stones at Calais stand in the dying light. The colour changes on them. The grey Lewisian gneiss, the most ancient rock in Europe, takes the colour of the sky and changes with it. The stones are dark against an orange sky. Then they are pale against a blue sky. Then they are silver in the moon, the same moon they were built to watch, rising over the hill to the south, the hill of grief, the hill of mourning, the hill whose profile the builders of Calais knew as intimately as they knew the faces of their families. And on the rare, clear nights, the stars come out above them, the same stars that have been rising and setting above these stones since before the stones were placed, and the Milky Way arches overhead in the way that it has always arched, and the builders of this place are gone, and the language they spoke is gone, and the stories they told around the fire are gone, and the names they gave, the hills and the stars, and the months of the year are gone, and what remains is this: the stones, the sky, the cycle of the light, the knowledge that the darkness has a limit, the hope, encoded in stone in a cold field on an Atlantic island 6,000 years ago, that the light comes back. It always has. And the stones, patient and permanent in their field on the coast of Lewis, are still here to show you exactly when. The person standing in that field now, in the diminishing light of a summer evening, might not know the name of the astronomical cycle that the monument was built to frame. They might not know the precise angle of the moon's declination at its major standstill. They might not know the name of the people who placed the stones, or the language those people spoke, or the specific ritual that was performed at this site when the moon appeared to skim the hill of grief before rising. They know almost none of the specific content that the builders of Calais intended their monument to communicate, but they feel something. Standing in this circle of grey Lewisian gneiss on the coast of an Atlantic island, with the Monument Avenue stretching away to the north, and the long sea horizon visible to the west, and the sky enormous above them, and the light failing, and the stars beginning to appear, they feel something. Something that is not easily named in modern categories. Something that the people who built this place would probably recognize, across all the differences of time and language and belief, as the thing they were trying to give to whoever came after them. The awareness of being in a place that matters, the sense of scale. the feeling of the cycles turning, the knowledge, held in the body rather than in the mind, that the world is very old and very large and very patient, and that the light has been returning to this field for longer than there have been people to notice it, and that it will keep returning for longer than there will be people to stand here and watch. The stone is old, the sky is older, the light is always coming back, and the stones are still here, still pointing, still encoding the knowledge that 5,000 years of Scottish prehistory invested in them, still waiting for whoever stands beside them to hear what they were built to say. Listen, the cycles turn, the light returns. This mattered then, it matters now, remember. The hill, known as Tap o' Noath in Aberdeenshire, rises to over 560 metres and is one of the most prominent landmarks in the northeast of Scotland. Its summit carries the remains of an Iron Age vitrified hill fort, one of many in Scotland where the stone walls were fused into a glassy mass by enormous heat generated during their construction or destruction, a phenomenon that remains incompletely explained and that has attracted considerable attention from researchers and enthusiasts alike. But the approach to Tap o' Noath, through the farmland of the Strathbogie Valley, takes you past several standing stones, single monoliths placed in the lower ground, positioned at intervals along what may once have been a recognized route toward the hill. These stones are not famous. They do not appear in the headline accounts of Scottish prehistory. They are simply there, in their fields, perhaps 4,000 years old, perhaps more, marking a route toward an elevation that was already significant before the hill fort was built on its summit. The route from the lowland farmland to the high ground, from the places where grain was grown and cattle were grazed, to the place where the widest view was available, where the sky could be watched across the full compass, where the horizon in every direction was visible without obstruction, this route was marked with stone. It was made permanent. It was embedded in the landscape in a way that would last beyond the individuals who walked it and beyond the specific communities that maintained it. The stones along that route are a form of infrastructure. They are also a form of commitment, a commitment to the practice of moving through the landscape in a certain way, with a certain awareness, toward a place that was worth the effort of the journey. The practice of walking to high places and watching the sky from them is one of the oldest human activities that can be documented archaeologically. The hilltop sites that were used as gathering places and observation points in the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods of Scotland are not simply convenient elevated locations. They were chosen because from them the full scope of the seasonal sky was available. You could see the sun trace its whole arc from horizon to horizon. You could watch the moon rise and set across its full range of positions. You could observe the stars throughout the night without any obstruction from the landscape, and you could see, from the high ground, the monument landscape spread out below you, the standing stones and the stone circles that marked the lower country, each of them visible from the right elevated viewpoint, each of them connected to the high ground by the sight line that the builders had established when they chose the position of the lower stone. The landscape of prehistoric Scotland was a layered system of sightlines, of visual connections between high and low, between monument and monument, between stone and horizon feature and celestial event. To understand the system fully, you would need to stand at dozens of points in it, at different times of year and different times of day, and trace the connections that the builders established between them. Nobody has done this completely for any part of Scotland. It is too large a task for any individual researcher. But the partial analyses that have been done are already revealing a complexity and coherence in the prehistoric landscape of Scotland that was not suspected even 50 years ago. The question of what kind of society could have organised and sustained the monument-building tradition across 5,000 years is one that archaeologists have been reconsidering in the light of the evidence from sites like the Ness of Brodgar. The old assumption was that large monuments required hierarchical societies, that the ability to mobilize the labor needed to build a stone circle or a chambered cairn indicated the presence of a powerful elite that could compel that labor. This assumption was partly derived from analogies with the historical civilizations of the ancient world, where large monuments were very often the product of coerced labor under centralized political control. But the evidence from Neolithic Scotland does not support this model. The egalitarian character of the Neolithic settlements, as far as it can be determined from the archaeological record, does not suggest a highly stratified society with powerful elites. The feasting evidence suggests communal participation on a voluntary basis rather than commanded labor. The distribution of effort across many sites over long periods suggests a tradition maintained by broad social consensus rather than imposed by central authority. The labor mobilization that built the Scottish stone circles was apparently voluntary, motivated by belief and social obligation rather than compulsion. This is important because it changes the understanding of what the monuments represent. They are not the products of power in the coercive sense. They are the products of commitment. The community that built the Ring of Brodgar was a community that wanted to build the Ring of Brodgar. Whatever their beliefs and whatever their social organization, they chose this project and sustained it across the time required to complete it because they understood it as necessary and meaningful. The monument is the expression of that collective will. That is a different kind of monument from a pyramid. It is a monument to agreement rather than to command. The social organization of Neolithic Scotland, such as it can be reconstructed, appears to have been structured around kinship networks and seasonal gathering cycles rather than permanent political hierarchies. Communities were probably small for most of the year, dispersed across the landscape in the pattern of mobile pastoralists who followed their animals through seasonal pastures. The gatherings that monument sites facilitated were the moments when these dispersed communities came together, when marriage alliances were formed and maintained, when disputes were settled, when knowledge was exchanged, when the astronomical observations of multiple groups could be compared and combined. The monument was not the headquarters of a centralized authority. It was the meeting place of a networked society. The difference matters because it changes the model of how such a society maintained its cultural traditions across time. It did not maintain them through institutional authority, through the imposition of correct practice by a dominant hierarchy. It maintained them through the gathering itself, through the repeated coming together at the monument, through the practice of the rituals that the monument was built to facilitate. The tradition was reproduced every time the community gathered, every time the astronomical alignment was demonstrated, every time the knowledge was transmitted to the younger generation by being shown rather than told. The monument was the school, the gathering was the lesson, the sky was the curriculum, and this system worked for 5,000 years. The Boyne Valley in Ireland is the most famous megalithic monument complex in the world. Newgrange, Knowth, and Dowth, the three great passage tombs that dominate the valley, are known to millions of people who will never visit them, through photographs and documentaries, and the annual media coverage of the winter solstice illumination of the Newgrange chamber. What is less widely known is the close relationship between the Boyne Valley monuments and the monuments of Orkney. The passage tomb tradition appears in both locations in its most elaborate form, and the architectural and artistic parallels between the sites are too close to be coincidental. The spiral carvings at Newgrange find close parallels in the passage graves of Orkney. The style of decorated stonework, the use of specific geometric motifs, the structural techniques of corbelled roofing, these elements appear in both locations, in forms that suggest either direct contact between the communities that built them, or a shared tradition, so closely maintained across the Irish Sea that the results were nearly identical. The maritime connection between Neolithic Ireland and Neolithic Scotland was real and significant. The monuments of both countries are expressions of a shared tradition that was maintained across the water through the movement of people, objects, and ideas in a way that has left its trace in stone on both shores. The Neolithic boat technology that made this maritime connection possible was more sophisticated than is sometimes acknowledged. The people who crossed the Irish Sea and the North Channel and the Minches and the waters between the mainland and the islands of the Outer Hebrides in the Neolithic period were doing so in wooden boats that have not survived. We have no direct physical evidence of the boats themselves, but we have the evidence of the connections they enabled, the shared material culture, the shared monument traditions, the genetic evidence of population movement across these waters. The people who built Challonaise and the people who built Newgrange were connected across the sea. The sea was not a barrier between them, it was a highway. And the monuments they built on either shore were expressions of a shared understanding of the cosmos, that the sea itself, with its own tidal cycles and its own relationship to the moon, probably contributed to rather than undermined. The tidal cycle is lunar. Anyone who lives beside the sea knows the relationship between the moon and the tide as a basic fact of coastal existence. The tides rise and fall with the moon's cycle. They are highest at the full moon and the new moon, when the gravitational pulls of the sun and moon combine, and lowest at the quarter moons, when those pulls partially cancel each other. The variation in tidal amplitude across the lunar month is a fact that could not have been missed by people who depended on coastal resources for their survival. The relationship between the moon and the sea was not an abstraction for Neolithic people who fished and gathered shellfish and navigated coastal waters. It was a practical, daily, observable reality. And this practical knowledge of the moon's relationship to the sea may be one of the foundations of the lunar astronomy that found such elaborate expression in the stone circles of Scotland. The people who built the recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire to frame the moon's rising and setting were also people who understood, from direct experience, that the moon governed the sea. The cosmological significance attributed to the moon was not derived only from astronomical observation in the abstract. It was grounded in the concrete reality of living beside a sea, whose behavior was visibly determined by the moon's position. The moon was powerful. Everyone could see it in the tides. The stone circles made that power visible in the sky, framing the moon's movements in permanent stone, acknowledging and honoring a force that was not simply distant and celestial, but immediately present in the rising and falling of the water on the shore. The seashore has a particular quality of light that people who live beside it recognize instantly. The light that comes off the sea is different from the light that comes off the land. It is more diffuse, more reflective, more variable. It changes with the time of day, and the state of the tide, and the weather, and the angle of the sun in a way that is endlessly variable and endlessly captivating. People who have grown up beside the sea and then moved to inland settings often speak of missing the sea light more than almost anything else. And the monuments of Scotland's coast and islands, the stone circles on the Orcadian peninsulas with their views of the shallow inland waters, the standing stones on the Atlantic coast of Lewis with the ocean visible in every western direction, the monuments of the Argyll coast with the islands scattered across the sea beyond them, these monuments were all built in the presence of sea light. The people who built them were living with that quality of light every day of their lives, and their monuments were shaped in that light, oriented in part to the sun and moon as they appeared above the sea horizon, coloured and textured by the same atmospheric conditions that give the coastal light of Scotland its distinctive quality. The monuments are not separable from the environment that produced them. They are expressions of that environment as much as they are expressions of the cosmological tradition that chose to build in it. The archaeology of Scotland's standing stone tradition has benefited enormously in recent years from the systematic application of new dating techniques. Optically stimulated luminescence dating, which measures the last time mineral grains in a deposit were exposed to light or heat, has allowed archaeologists to date the construction events at stone circle sites with a precision that was not previously available. Before OS dating was widely applied, the dates assigned to most stone circles were based on the associated pottery and other datable materials found in or around them, which gave approximate ranges of centuries rather than decades. OSL dating, combined with radiocarbon dating of organic materials and archaeomagnetic dating of burnt features, has allowed the construction sequences at some Scottish sites to be pinned down to within a few decades. This precision matters because it allows the monument-building tradition to be understood in its historical context rather than simply in a broad prehistoric context. When we know that a specific stone circle was built within a specific 50-year window, we can begin to ask what was happening in the broader social and cultural landscape of that period that might have prompted or facilitated its construction. We can begin to understand the tradition not just as a generic Neolithic or Bronze Age phenomenon, but as a sequence of specific decisions made by specific communities in specific historical circumstances. The results of this more precise dating have been illuminating. At some sites, what appeared from surface examination to be a single monument turns out to be a sequence of construction events spread across several centuries. The outer ring of a stone circle may have been added 100 years after the inner circle was built. The stone avenue may have been added 200 years after the central monument was established. The gradual development of a monument over generations, each generation adding to or modifying what the previous generation had built, is a pattern that appears repeatedly in Scottish prehistoric archaeology, and that helps to explain the complexity and variety of the surviving monuments. They were not built all at once by a single community according to a single plan. They were developed over time, accumulated, elaborated, and modified in response to changing social needs and changing astronomical knowledge. The monuments are not snapshots of a moment in the Neolithic or Bronze Age. They are records of processes that unfolded over generations. They are, in a sense, biographical, encoding not just the knowledge of a single moment, but the history of a tradition's development over centuries. The people who modified and elaborated the monuments over generations were making decisions based on what was already there. They were building on the work of their predecessors, adding to it, refining it, adjusting what did not quite work, and extending what did. This is a creative and intellectual process as well as a physical one. The decision to add a stone avenue to an existing circle, or to insert a chamber cairn at the center of an existing monument, or to adjust the orientation of a newly planned monument to align more precisely with the horizon feature that an existing monument only approximately faced. These decisions required understanding of what the existing monuments were trying to do and a judgment about how to do it better or differently. The monument builders of Scotland were engaged in a continuous process of learning from their predecessors and improving on their work. They were, in the most meaningful sense, part of an intellectual tradition, a tradition that happened to express itself in stone rather than in text, a tradition whose archive was the landscape rather than the library, but a tradition nonetheless, with a history of development and refinement that extended across millennia. The stone circle at Temple Wood in Kilmartin Glen was built in stages that can now be traced with some precision. The first monument on the site was a timber circle, the post holes of which were discovered beneath the stone circle during excavation. This was replaced by a stone circle that was subsequently modified, with additional stones added and the geometry of the circle adjusted. The monument was in use for approximately 1,000 years, from the early Neolithic through the Bronze Age, and the evidence of its use across that period includes not only the structural modifications, but also deposits of material that indicate feasting, ritual deposition, and burial. Temple Wood is not unique in this pattern of sequential development. Avebury in England, Brodgar in Orkney, Callanaes in Lewis, all show evidence of sequential development across extended periods. The monuments were not monuments to a finished idea. They were ongoing projects, developing in response to the community's evolving understanding of what they were for and how they could best serve their purpose. The standing stones of Scotland continue to be discovered, not at a pace that would suggest a sudden dramatic increase in the number of known sites, but steadily, year by year, as aerial photography and LiDAR survey reveal features in the landscape that ground survey had missed, as farmers and walkers report features that they have noticed in fields and on hillsides, as the national record is systematically reviewed, and sites that were imprecisely documented in previous centuries are properly mapped and recorded. Every year, the national database grows. Every year, the understanding of how dense the ancient monument landscape of Scotland actually was becomes more complete. And every year, the gap between what was once thought and what is now known widens in the direction of greater complexity and greater sophistication and greater extent than any previous estimate had suggested. The people who built the standing stones of Scotland were not a single people. Over the 5,000 years of the monument-building tradition, the population of Scotland changed substantially. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, who were the first post-glacial inhabitants of Scotland, gave way to Neolithic farmers who carried a predominantly Anatolian genetic ancestry. Those farmers were substantially replaced, in the period around 2,500 years before the Common Era, by incoming populations carrying steppe ancestry from the Pontic grasslands. Those mixed Neolithic steppe populations then continued to develop in place, absorbing further inputs through the Bronze Age and Iron Age from continental Europe, until the historical period brought the documented migrations of the Scots from Ireland, the Norse from Scandinavia, the Normans from France, and the various other contributions to the genetic mosaic that constitutes the modern Scottish population. None of these transitions was absolute. Each new input mixed with what was already there. The Neolithic farmers did not eliminate the Mesolithic hunters. The steppe migrants did not eliminate the Neolithic farmers. The continuity was genetic as well as cultural, even when the balance of the mixture shifted substantially. And through all of these demographic changes, the monument-building tradition persisted, adapted, and continued. The tradition outlasted the people who started it, and was adopted and continued by the people who came after. This persistence is one of the most extraordinary facts about the Scottish standing stone tradition. It suggests that the tradition was compelling enough to be adopted by populations who had no genetic or direct cultural continuity with its founders. The incoming steppe ancestry populations of the early Bronze Age found a landscape full of Neolithic monuments and chose to add their own monuments to it rather than to clear and rebuild. The astronomical tradition, encoded in the Neolithic monuments, was apparently persuasive enough, or practically useful enough, or both, to be adopted and elaborated by people who were not the children of the people who had established it. The monuments transmitted the tradition even across demographic discontinuity. The stones taught the newcomers what the landscape was for. This is perhaps the deepest reason that Scotland has more standing stones than any other country in Europe, not simply because the tradition was born here, or because the geographic conditions sustained it, or because the culture that developed here was particularly committed to it, but because the landscape that the tradition created, the densely monumentalized landscape of prehistoric Scotland, was itself so compelling, so clearly the expression of a sophisticated engagement with the sky and the earth and the cycles of time, that every subsequent population that settled in it found itself drawn into the tradition rather than able to dismiss it. The stones were persuasive, not in the way that arguments are persuasive, through logic and evidence and the force of reason, but in the way that the landscape itself is persuasive, through presence and permanence, and the accumulated weight of meaning that the generations of builders had invested in them. The stones were there. They were old. They were clearly the product of great effort and great knowledge. And they still worked. The sun still rose where they said it would rise. The moon still moved through the positions they had been built to frame. The knowledge encoded in them was still demonstrably correct. What kind of newcomer, arriving in a landscape full of stones that accurately predicted the movements of the sky, would choose to ignore them? The standing stones of Scotland are persuasive because they are true, and their truth is the reason they have been standing for 5,000 years and will probably still be standing 5,000 years from now, pointing at the same sky, encoding the same knowledge, waiting for whoever comes next to stand beside them and look up and understand. The final mystery of the Scottish standing stones is not really a mystery at all once you have sat with the evidence long enough. The question of why there are so many of them, why Scotland specifically, why the tradition lasted so long and went so deep, resolves into a set of interconnected answers that together constitute something like an explanation, even if the specific content of the belief system that drove the building is not recoverable in its original form. Scotland had the geography that made astronomical tracking urgent. It had the Atlantic maritime connections that brought the megalithic tradition north and kept it connected to the broader monument-building world of the Atlantic facade. It had the specific cultural elaborations, the recumbent stone circles, the colonized lunar observatory, the Orcadian ceremonial complex, that took the received tradition and developed it into something uniquely Scottish and uniquely sophisticated. It had the demographic resilience that kept the tradition going through the major population transitions of the prehistoric period. And it had the landscape itself, the specific qualities of the light and the sky and the sea and the mountains that made the relationship between the human and the cosmic particularly immediate and particularly compelling for the people who lived in it. All of these things together produced the standing stones. The dark reason, the reason that sits behind all the specific causes and specific traditions and specific astronomical facts, is simply this. The people of prehistoric Scotland looked at the sky and understood that what they saw there mattered. They built that understanding in stone, and Scotland is still full of the evidence of what they understood. The sky above the ring of Brodgar on a clear Orcadian night is extraordinary. The latitude is far enough north that in summer the sky never fully darkens, and in winter the stars are out for 18 hours of every 24. The Milky Way, which is invisible to most people in the modern world because of light pollution, blazes overhead in a way that makes the word galaxy feel insufficient. You can see the structure of it, the bands and rifts and concentrations of light that are hundreds of billions of stars at distances that are beyond ordinary comprehension. And the ring of Brodgar, the great circle of grey standing stones on its narrow isthmus between two lochs, is positioned under that sky with the precision of an instrument designed to observe it, which is exactly what it is. The builders of the ring of Brodgar looked up at that sky night after night, and understood things about it that they then built into the circle at their feet. The circle is the instrument. The sky is the subject. And the knowledge that the instrument encodes is still there, still readable, still true. Go to Brodgar on a clear night in winter and stand in the circle and look up, and you will see what the builders saw. The same stars, the same moon, the same Milky Way, the same sky that has been turning above this circle for 5,000 years, unchanged and unchanging, patient and vast and indifferent to all the human history that has unfolded beneath it. Stones endure, the sky endures. The knowledge in the stones is the knowledge of the sky. And the builders, who understood that knowledge and built it in stone so that it would outlast them, got what they wanted. The knowledge is still here. The stones are still standing. And the sky is still above them, still doing what it has always done, still offering itself to anyone willing to stand in the right place and look. That is the real reason. The reason behind the dark reason. Not mystery, not suppression, not secrets. The reason is knowledge. The reason is commitment. The reason is the human impulse to take what is understood and make it permanent, to encode the important things in the most durable medium available, to speak to the future across the gulf of time with the confidence that the future will have the same sky and the same need to understand what the sky is saying. Scotland did that 5,000 times over 5,000 years. The stones are still standing. The sky is still there. The conversation is still going. This is where it started. And in a very real sense, it has not ended. There is one more thing worth saying, and it is the simplest thing in the whole story. The standing stones of Scotland are, at their core, an act of love. Not love in the sentimental sense, though that may have been part of it too. Love in the sense of deep care for something beyond the self. The people who built the stones cared about the sky. They cared about the cycles. They cared about the community that would come after them and need to know what they had learned. They cared enough about all of those things to spend years of their lives and the collective labor of their communities, building the knowledge into permanent stone so that it would not be lost when they were gone. That care, that commitment to the future, that willingness to invest enormous effort in something whose primary beneficiary would be people not yet born, is not a primitive impulse. It is one of the most sophisticated and admirable things a human community can do. The standing stones of Scotland are the evidence of a civilization that cared, not a civilization in the bureaucratic, hierarchical, urban sense of the word, but a civilization in the deeper sense. A community of people with a shared understanding of the world and a commitment to passing that understanding forward across time. The stones are that commitment, made visible and made permanent. Still standing, which means the commitment worked, which means the love that built them was not wasted. The people who built the ring of Brodgar and the stones of Callanise and the recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire and the standing stones of Kilmartin Glen and the stone rows of Caithness and the thousands of single monoliths that still stand in the fields and on the hillsides of Scotland, those people built something that has lasted. And it will last for as long as there is anyone to stand beside the stones and look up at the sky and feel, in some way that transcends the specific knowledge and the specific belief system, that this matters. That the sky matters. That the cycles matter. That understanding matters. That the future matters. The stones are still standing. The sky is still there. The feeling is still real. And Scotland is still full of the evidence that once upon a time, people built what they understood in stone, because they wanted the future to know. That is the whole story. That is the dark reason. There is nothing dark about it. The peat of the Outer Hebrides has been accumulating since the Neolithic period. Layers of compressed plant material, each centimetre representing decades of growth and decay in the wet Atlantic climate, have built up over the mineral soil that the Neolithic farmers of Lewis first worked when they cleared the land and planted their crops. Below the peat, the evidence of that early settlement survives. Plough marks, seeds. The standing stones rise through the ancient peat, too hard and too heavy for 6,000 years to overwhelm.